Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley, the place where stories linger long after the lights go out. Tonight, we prepared chilling tales paired with the soothing sound of rain to ignite your imagination and make your heart race. If you feel the cold creeping in, tap that like button. It helps keep the shadows alive. Tell us in the comments where you're listening from or share the scariest moment that sent shivers down your spine. Don't forget to subscribe. You wouldn't want to miss what lurks in the darkness ahead. The man who wasn't my partner. I had been working the night shift for months, and it had always been a routine, long, quiet hours spent patrolling empty streets, checking the same intersections, and running the same red lights in the quiet hum of the city. The usual patrol. Nothing ever happened. Until that night. It started like any other shift. My partner, Officer Miller, and I were assigned to patrol the southeastern district. The city felt heavy with silence as we cruised through dimly lit streets. He was an experienced officer, a calm presence in the chaos of nighttime patrols, and we made a good team. I trusted him, at least, I thought I did. It was around 2 a.m. when I first noticed something was off. We were parked near a small park. I was scanning the surroundings as I checked our logs and radio chatter. I glanced over at Miller, who had his usual neutral expression, but something about the way he was sitting didn't feel right. He was staring straight ahead, but his posture was stiff, almost too stiff. "Hey, Miller," I said, but my voice sounded too loud in the quiet night. He didn't respond. I repeated myself, louder this time. Still nothing. I turned to face him fully, the hairs on the back of my neck rising. He was sitting there, perfectly still, his eyes fixed on something in the distance. His face, though, it wasn't his face. The features were the same, but the way his eyes were blank, the tension in his jaw, it didn't feel like him at all. I leaned closer, trying to peer into his eyes, searching for the familiar warmth. But they were cold, like empty sockets. His lips barely moved when he spoke, his voice sounding distant, almost as if it came from somewhere else entirely. "Is everything okay, Miller?" I asked, my voice shaking slightly. His head turned slowly toward me, and I froze. The look in his eyes was empty, emotionless. He didn't look like my partner anymore. I felt a shiver run down my spine. He didn't blink, didn't shift his gaze. It was as though I was looking at a stranger, someone who was wearing Miller's skin but was not him. "Everything's fine, just scanning the area," he replied, his voice flat, almost rehearsed. I nodded, trying to push the unease away, but my mind couldn't let go of the feeling that something was horribly wrong. I didn't know why, but I suddenly felt trapped in the patrol car with him. The air seemed thicker, the streetlights dimmer. It was as if the world had become muted, distant. After a few minutes, I decided to get out and walk around. I needed space. But as soon as I opened the door and stepped outside, I heard the engine of our patrol car start up. The door closed with a soft click, and I looked back to see Miller behind the wheel. My heart skipped a beat. The car had been off just seconds ago. I had left him inside, but now he was driving. I rushed to the window, banging my fist against the glass, but the car didn't slow down. Miller's expression remained the same, blank, lifeless. I ran after it, adrenaline flooding my veins, but the car kept moving, picking up speed. Panic started to rise in my chest. I couldn't keep up. My breath was short, and my legs burned from the effort, but I couldn't stop. Something deep inside told me that if I lost sight of that car, I would lose him, or worse, I would lose myself. I couldn't let it happen. Then, without warning, the car stopped. The engine cut off, and Miller's figure, if it was even Miller anymore, exited the car, walking slowly into the darkness of the park. I stopped dead in my tracks, watching him disappear. I should have stayed in the car, called for backup, but something kept me frozen, rooted to the spot. I followed, cautiously, staying far behind, watching his every move. He didn't look back. He moved with an unsettling precision, as if he knew exactly where he was going. The park was empty, save for the shadows of the trees that stretched out like black fingers, but I knew I wasn't alone. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he stopped. In front of him was a small stone bench, and he sat down. That's when I saw it. In the shadows, just beyond his peripheral vision, something stirred. It wasn't human. It was a figure, dark and indistinct, moving just out of reach, almost blending into the night. I froze. That thing, it was watching him, or maybe it was watching me. I couldn't be sure. I crept closer, my heart pounding in my ears. The more I watched, the more I realized that this wasn't a normal situation. This wasn't a normal patrol anymore. Miller wasn't Miller. Suddenly, I heard a voice. A low, guttural whisper that seemed to come from the shadows. It didn't belong to Miller. It was something else. You should have stayed in the car, the voice growled. Before I could react, I was grabbed from behind. I struggled, my hands pushing against the figure's chest, but it was too strong. I couldn't move. And then I heard it, the sound of Miller's voice, but it was wrong. It was the same lifeless, empty tone from earlier. Get away from him, he said, his words almost robotic. I saw him, if it was still him, walk toward me, his hands held out like he was going to help. But there was no help. There was no safety. The figure behind me stepped into the light, and I saw its face, a twisted mockery of human form, pale and featureless, a shadowy void where eyes should have been. It grinned, a sickening, inhuman smile, as it pulled me further into the darkness. The last thing I remember was Miller's voice again, saying something that didn't make sense. Run. Don't look back. And then the world went black. When I woke up, I was back in the patrol car. The streets were quiet again, the city calm. Miller was sitting next to me, just as he had been when the shift began, his expression blank, his eyes empty, just like before. But something inside me had changed. I wasn't sure if I had just imagined everything, or if I had really seen something else out there in the dark. But I knew one thing for certain, I wasn't going to ask him if it had been real. I already knew the answer. And it wasn't him. The dead clown. It was one of those nights where everything felt off. The air was thick with fog, and the streetlights cast long, eerie shadows that seemed to stretch far beyond what was natural. I had just gotten off work and decided to take a walk through the park, something to clear my head. I had been under a lot of stress lately, and I figured some fresh air would help. The park, as always, was mostly empty at this hour. A few joggers here and there, and the occasional couple strolling, but mostly it was just me and the rustling trees. As I walked along the winding path, I saw something up ahead, sitting on one of the benches. It was a man, or at least it seemed like a man. He was dressed in a brightly colored suit, complete with the red nose, oversized shoes, and painted face. A clown. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe he was just some guy trying to get attention or filming a weird video. But as I got closer, I noticed something that made my stomach drop, a a thick layer of makeup caked on his face, almost like it had been smeared on in a hurry. His eyes were wide and unblinking, staring straight ahead. I slowed down, unsure of what to do. The man didn't move, didn't blink, didn't even seem to breathe. I thought maybe he was just some prankster, but there was something about him that felt wrong. His suit was old, the colors faded as though it hadn't been washed in years, and there was a strange smell in the air, like decay. Suddenly, a gust of wind blew through the park, and the clown's head jerked to the side, as if caught by some invisible force. My heart skipped a beat. I froze, standing there, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. Was he alive? Was he waiting for me to approach? Or was he already dead? I took a step back, and that's when I heard it, a low, rasping sound, like someone trying to breathe through a clogged throat. I turned, hoping it was just a cat or some animal, but the park was still empty. The sound came again, louder this time, and I realized with a jolt that it was coming from the clown. He was laughing. Not the cheerful kind of laugh, but a deep, guttural sound that rumbled from his chest, like it had been trapped there for years. It echoed through the empty park, sending a shiver down my spine. I wanted to run, but my feet wouldn't move. Something kept me rooted to the spot. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was fear, but I couldn't turn away. The clown slowly turned his head, his painted eyes meeting mine. The smile on his face, once bright and exaggerated, now looked twisted, like it had been carved into his face. His lips parted, revealing sharp, yellow teeth. "Why are you here?" he whispered, his voice raspy, as though it was coming from a grave. I couldn't answer. I couldn't move. The air around me grew colder, and I felt a pressure on my chest, like I was being suffocated by the very fog that surrounded the park. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the clown stopped laughing. His head snapped back forward, and his body stiffened. The painted smile on his face disappeared, replaced by an expression of pure emptiness. I was still standing there, watching him, but I wasn't sure if I was seeing him or if he was seeing me. Then, in one fluid motion, the clown stood up. His body moved unnaturally, jerking like a puppet on strings, and he started walking toward me. His footsteps were slow, dragging across the pavement with an unsettling sound, like nails scraping on stone. "Leave," he rasped, his voice no longer playful, but full of malice. But I couldn't move. I couldn't run. It was like my legs had turned to stone, and I could only watch as he came closer, his laughter starting again, louder this time. The echo filled the air, bouncing off the trees, the benches, the swings. And then, just as he was almost upon me, I saw it, his face, no longer painted with makeup, but rotting. His skin was peeling away, revealing bone underneath. His eyes were empty sockets, black and lifeless, and his mouth was stretched into a grotesque, gaping hole. In a panic, I finally broke free from my paralysis, and I turned to run. My heart pounded in my chest, my legs pumping harder than they ever had before. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. I could hear him following, the dragging footsteps getting closer, closer. And then, silence. I reached the street, breathless, eyes wild, and turned back to look. There was nothing behind me. The park was empty. No clown. No figure chasing me. Just the quiet, foggy night. But I could still hear that laughter echoing in my mind, the sound of it growing louder, as though it was inside my head. I never went back to that park. And to this day, I never walk alone at night. The clown's face, half rotted, half painted, still haunts me. The painting of sorrow. I had never been much of an art enthusiast, but when I first saw the advertisement for the gallery's newest exhibit, something tugged at me. It was titled The Portraits of Mourning, and there was a particular piece mentioned, a painting known as the Weeping Image. They said it was unlike anything anyone had ever seen before, so haunting, so real that it seemed to capture the very essence of sorrow. The gallery was tucked away on the edge of town, in a quiet street that most people overlooked. As I entered, I was greeted by the quiet murmur of voices, the soft shuffle of feet on polished floors, and the faint scent of old wood and oil paints. The lighting was dim, casting shadows that seemed to dance across the walls. I walked through the exhibit, passing by portraits and sculptures, each one more lifelike than the last. But none of them held my attention, not like the Weeping Image did. It stood at the far end of the room, framed by heavy velvet curtains, almost like it was hiding from the rest of the world. The closer I got, the heavier the atmosphere became. I could feel the air grow thick, the temperature drop by a degree or two. It was a large painting, perhaps 6 feet tall, and it depicted a figure, a woman, though she was not quite human. Her face was twisted in agony, her eyes swollen and red, as though she had been crying for days, months, years. Her tears were not just liquid, but dark, like ink, dripping down her face and pooling at her feet. The longer I stared at her, the more I felt like I could hear her sobbing, the sound so faint that I questioned whether it was real or just my mind playing tricks on me. I found myself drawn to the painting, unable to look away. The details were so vivid, so painfully clear. The woman's fingers were clutching at her own face, as if trying to hold herself together, but the sadness in her expression seemed to seep from the canvas and into the room. It felt like her sorrow was contagious, like it was slowly wrapping itself around me, pulling me deeper into her world. As I stood there, lost in the painting, a soft voice interrupted my thoughts. "Quite striking, isn't it?" the gallery attendant said, her voice almost a whisper. I nodded, still unable to take my eyes off the painting. It's like she's real. Like I can feel what she's feeling. The attendant's smile was thin, almost imperceptible. That's the nature of the Weeping Image. They say whoever gazes at it long enough can hear her cries. But be warned, some don't come back the same. The sorrow, it lingers. I didn't know what she meant by that, but something about her tone sent a chill through me. I wanted to ask more, but before I could speak, the attendant walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the gallery. I shook my head, trying to brush off the unease that had settled in my chest. I wasn't going to let a painting affect me. It was just a piece of art. But even as I told myself that, I felt a cold sweat forming on the back of my neck. The image of the woman's face, the twisted expression of grief, kept playing over and over in my mind. I turned to leave, but as I did, something caught my eye. The painting, it seemed to be moving. The woman's tears were flowing, not just on the canvas, but dripping down the frame onto the floor. It wasn't possible. I blinked and looked again. The tears were still falling, but now they were pooling around the base of the painting, seeping out of the frame and onto the marble floor. A feeling of dread flooded over me. I had to get out of there. But as I turned to leave, the door slammed shut and the lights flickered. The air grew thick again, and for a moment, I could have sworn I heard the faint sound of crying, soft and muffled, like it was coming from within the walls themselves. I rushed toward the door, my heart racing, my breath shallow, but when I tried to open it, it wouldn't budge. I pulled harder, my panic growing with every second. The crying grew louder, more frantic, until it felt like the whole gallery was alive with sorrow. The room was spinning, the walls closing in on me. And then I heard her voice. "Help me," it whispered, barely audible over the sound of her sobbing. "Please, help me." I froze, my hand still gripping the doorknob, but my body paralyzed with fear. The voice wasn't from the painting anymore. It was real, as if she was standing right behind me. I turned slowly, expecting to see something, anything, emerging from the darkness. But there was nothing. Just the empty room, the painting, and the sound of crying. I don't know how much time passed before I finally managed to break free from the room. When I stepped outside, the cold night air hit my face, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, I could breathe again. The gallery door slammed shut behind me, and I didn't look back. I didn't tell anyone what happened that night. I couldn't. They'd think I was crazy. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the sorrow from that painting had followed me like a shadow that wouldn't let go. Even now, years later, I can still hear the crying sometimes, soft, distant, and filled with endless grief. It's like it's always there, just beneath the surface of my thoughts. And I know it's waiting for me to look at it again. The workaholic. I used to think I had everything under control. My life was organized, precise, predictable. I was a workaholic, yes, but I was proud of it. I ran a small marketing agency, and over the years, I built it from the ground up. My colleagues respected me, clients relied on me, and I always delivered on time. But at the same time, there was this quiet, nagging feeling I couldn't shake off, this persistent need to do more, to push harder, to never stop. I remember the first time I noticed something wasn't quite right. It was late one evening, around midnight. I was at the office, as usual, hunched over my desk, staring at the glowing screen of my laptop. The building was silent, everyone else long gone home. But I didn't mind. Work was my escape. It was the one thing that kept me grounded, that made me feel useful. The office lights flickered once, then twice. I didn't think much of it, probably just a malfunction, nothing to worry about. But when I reached for my coffee mug, I noticed something strange. There was a figure standing at the end of the hallway. I froze, staring at it. The figure was tall, dressed in dark clothes, and their face was obscured by a large brimmed hat. "Hello?" I called out, my voice cutting through the stillness. There was no answer, just the slow, steady rhythm of my heartbeat. I got up, my legs stiff from hours of sitting, and walked toward the figure. As I got closer, I felt this wave of unease wash over me. There was something off about the way the figure stood, as if it didn't belong to the world I knew. Just as I was about to speak again, the figure turned and walked into the shadows. I rushed to the spot where it had stood, but by the time I reached it, there was no one there. The hallway was empty, eerily quiet. I checked all the rooms, but everything was as it should be. Maybe I was just tired, I thought. Maybe the exhaustion was starting to get to me. So, I shrugged it off and returned to my desk, convincing myself that it was all in my head. But that night, something changed. Over the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I was in the office, I'd catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye, figures darting into rooms, shadows flickering across the walls. But when I turned to look, there was nothing there. I began staying later and later, driven by the need to finish projects, to meet deadlines, to push myself harder. I stopped taking breaks, stopped eating properly, stopped sleeping. I was on the edge, but I couldn't stop. My mind felt like it was constantly spinning, my body a mechanical machine that I had no control over. One night, as I sat in the darkened office, I heard it again, the soft shuffle of footsteps behind me. This time, I didn't hesitate. I whipped around, expecting to see someone, anyone. But again, there was nothing. And then the voice came. It was faint at first, like a whisper from far away. But as it grew louder, I recognized it. It was my own voice, repeating the same words over and over. Work harder. Never stop. You're not good enough. I felt a chill run down my spine as the voice echoed in the room, and I looked around desperately for the source. But all I saw was the same empty office, the same cold walls, the same sterile glow of the fluorescent lights. I was alone. Or so I thought. The figure appeared again that night, standing in the same spot at the end of the hallway. This time, it wasn't a fleeting glimpse. It was there, solid and undeniable. I could feel its presence, the oppressive weight of it pressing down on me. I tried to move, to leave, but my legs felt like they were made of stone. The figure started walking toward me, slow and deliberate, and I could feel my pulse quicken. As it got closer, I could see its face. It was me. The figure was me, older, more worn, with hollow eyes and a face that was devoid of life. It didn't speak. It didn't need to. Its presence was enough. I could hear the whispers in my mind again, urging me to keep working, to never stop, to sacrifice everything for the sake of achievement. The figure stopped just in front of me, and I felt something inside me snap. I reached out, trying to touch it, but as my hand brushed against its cold, lifeless skin, I felt something strange, something like my very soul being drained from me, like all the energy, all the life force I had left, was being sucked away. I fell to my knees, gasping for breath, but the figure only stared at me, its hollow eyes boring into my soul. You've given everything, and still, it's never enough, it whispered, its voice identical to my own. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, the figure vanished, leaving me alone in the silent office. I don't remember how long I sat there afterward, trembling, my body racked with exhaustion. But the next morning, when I looked in the mirror, I saw the toll it had taken on me. My eyes were sunken, my face pale, my hair unkempt. I looked like I hadn't slept in weeks, and I realized, with a sinking feeling, that I hadn't allowed myself to stop. I knew then what had happened. The work, the endless drive, the obsession had consumed me. It wasn't just the job that had taken everything from me. It was the belief that I wasn't enough, that I had to keep going, no matter the cost. I haven't been back to the office since. I left everything behind, the deadlines, the meetings, the projects. But the figure still haunts me, lurking in the corners of my mind. Every time I close my eyes, I hear it whispering, work harder. Never stop. And I wonder if I'll ever truly escape it. The murderous flock. I had always loved the quiet of the countryside. It was my escape from the fast-paced, stress-filled world of city life. I moved to the small village about a year ago, seeking peace and solitude, and for the most part, it had been just that, until the birds came. It started innocuously enough. I'd walk through the village square on my way to the market, and there would be the occasional crow, sitting on a telephone wire, its black feathers gleaming in the sun. But then, one morning, I noticed something strange. There were more of them. Dozens, maybe hundreds, perched in the trees and on the rooftops, their glossy eyes tracking my every movement. At first, I thought it was just a seasonal migration, nothing out of the ordinary. But over the next few weeks, their numbers grew. I'd hear them before I saw them, 'cause that echoed across the quiet fields, a strange, unsettling sound that sent chills down my spine. The birds were always watching, always waiting. I felt their presence even when I couldn't see them. One evening, as I was walking back from the market, I took a shortcut through the woods behind my house. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the path, and I felt the air grow cold. That's when I heard it, a fluttering or rustling, like wings cutting through the stillness of the evening. I stopped, straining my ears, but there was no one around. The trees were empty, but the air felt heavy. Then, I saw it, just a glimpse of movement high in the branches, like something watching me from above. I quickened my pace, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. As I approached the clearing near the edge of the woods, I froze. The sky was darkening, and there, in the fading light, I saw them. The crows. They were everywhere. Perched on the branches of the trees, on the ground, on the roof of my house, there had to be hundreds of them. I stood motionless, my breath shallow, my heart hammering in my chest. The birds were silent, their eyes locked on me, and I could feel their gaze like an icy weight pressing down on me. A single crow took flight, soaring just above my head, its wings cutting through the air with a strange, predatory grace. The others followed, moving in unison, as if controlled by some unseen force. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I felt rooted to the spot, paralyzed by the sheer intensity of their presence. Suddenly, the silence was shattered by a terrifying sound, a chorus of caws, sharp and guttural, filling the air like a warning. The crows circled above me, their wings beating in unison, creating a storm of feathers and noise. I could hear the screeching, the calls growing louder, more frantic. Then, one of them dove toward me. I flinched, but it veered away at the last moment, only to be replaced by another. The birds were closing in, surrounding me from every direction. I tried to run, but my legs felt like lead. Another crow dove, this time scraping my arm with its sharp talons. The pain shot through me, but there was no time to react. I had to escape. I stumbled into the woods, branches whipping in my face as I ran blindly through the trees. The sound of wings beating in the air was deafening, and I could feel the crows following me, their calls growing louder, more insistent. It was like they were hurting me, driving me deeper into the forest. Finally, I broke free from the trees and into an open field. The birds seemed to pause for a moment, hovering above me, watching. My heart raced, and I turned to look back at the village, hoping to see the safety of my house. But when I turned, I saw something far worse. The crows were no longer just watching. They were on the ground, circling the village, a dark mass of black feathers and beady eyes. I saw the villagers walking slowly toward the center of the square, their faces blank, expressionless. They moved like sleepwalkers, as though they were being drawn to the crows by some invisible force. The birds had done something to them. I couldn't tell what, but the sight of them, so calm, so lifeless, filled me with dread. I turned back to the woods, but I could feel the crows closing in again, like a noose tightening around me. I ran. I don't remember how long I ran for, or how far I went. My body was numb, my mind foggy with fear. But eventually, I found myself at the edge of the village, the birds no longer in sight. The caws had stopped. The silence was deafening. I never went back to that village. I left everything behind and never looked back. But even now, when I close my eyes, I can hear them, those crows, calling, circling, waiting. I wonder if they're still there, still watching, still hunting for someone else to join their murderous flock. And I wonder if I ever really escaped. The girl in the windows. I first saw her on the 5th floor. It was late, around midnight, and I had just returned home after a long shift at the restaurant. My apartment was on the 3rd floor of an old building, one of those places that had a certain charm to it despite the peeling paint and broken tiles. The building had a history, stories whispered by neighbors about its strange architecture and the old rumors that surrounded it. But, like most people, I ignored those stories, chalking them up to idle gossip. I was just about to unlock the door to my apartment when something caught my eye from the corner of the building. Through the dusty, cracked window on the 5th floor, I saw her. She was standing there, motionless, staring out into the night, her long hair cascading down her back like a dark waterfall. The moonlight bathed her figure, casting strange shadows against the walls behind her. At first, I thought she was just another person like me, lost in the quiet of the night. But something about her stillness, something about the way she didn't move at all, unsettled me. I couldn't tear my eyes away, and for a moment, I found myself staring at her, transfixed. Then, something happened that made my blood run cold. Slowly, she raised her arms, as if reaching for something in the air. Her hair swayed with an unnatural grace, almost like it was moving of its own accord, the ends floating in the windless room. And before my eyes, she began to rise. Her feet lifted off the ground, and she hovered, her body drifting upwards like a delicate feather caught in an invisible current. I gasped, unable to look away. Was I seeing things? Maybe I was still tired, the exhaustion of the day playing tricks on my mind. But the more I stared, the clearer it became. The girl wasn't just standing there. She was flying, rising slowly, gracefully, like she belonged there, like the night itself was her domain. I stumbled back from the window, panic starting to grip my chest. Had anyone else seen her? I quickly looked around the building, checking the neighboring windows, but they were all dark. No one seemed to notice, no one seemed to care. I turned back to the 5th floor window, but she was gone. The next few days were a blur of unease. I tried to shake the image of the girl from my mind, but she haunted me. I couldn't focus at work, couldn't sleep. Every time I walked past that part of the building, my eyes would instinctively drift toward the 5th floor, hoping to catch a glimpse of her again. But the window was always empty. Then, a week later, I saw her again. This time, it was from my own window. I was sitting on the couch, scrolling through my phone, when I glanced out at the street below. And there she was, hovering just outside the building, high above the street. Her long hair floated around her like a veil, and her limbs moved with eerie fluidity, as though she was caught in a dance. The most unsettling part was her eyes, wide and unblinking, staring directly at me. She seemed to know I was watching. She didn't smile, didn't acknowledge me in any way. She just hovered there, suspended in the air, her gaze locked on mine as though she was waiting for something. I panicked. I slammed the window shut, my heart racing. I could feel the weight of her stare even through the glass, a cold, oppressive pressure that made it hard to breathe. I wanted to scream, to run out of my apartment, but I couldn't move. I felt trapped. The following night, I couldn't resist. I had to know what was going on. I couldn't just ignore her anymore. I gathered the little courage I had left and decided to go up to the 5th floor. The hallway was silent, the air thick with dust and neglect. The faint smell of mildew lingered in the corners, and the only sound was the creaking of the old wood beneath my feet. When I reached the door to the 5th floor, I hesitated. Should I knock? Should I just leave? I wasn't sure what I was expecting to find, but my curiosity was stronger than my fear. I pushed the door open. The floor was empty. Not a soul in sight. There was no sign of the girl. I stepped inside, my eyes scanning the dimly lit space. It was a mess, paper strewn across the floor, old furniture covered in sheets, and broken windows letting in the cold night air. But there was something else, something that chilled me to the bone. In the far corner of the room, near one of the broken windows, I saw a pile of long, black hair. It was tangled and matted, as if it had been torn out in large clumps. And beneath it, barely visible in the dim light, I saw the faint outline of a body, still lifeless. I froze. My mind struggled to comprehend what I was seeing. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be happening. Then, I heard it. A soft whisper, barely audible, coming from behind me. Don't leave. I spun around, my heart in my throat, but there was no one there. The room was still. The girl, the thing that had been flying, that had haunted my thoughts, was gone. I rushed out of the room, slamming the door behind me. I could still feel her eyes on me, could still hear the whisper in the back of my mind. And even now, months later, I can't escape it. Every time I pass that building, I glance up, hoping to never see her again, but always terrified that I will. She's still out there, somewhere, watching, waiting. And I know, deep down, that one day, she'll come for me. The Devil's Bargain. It all started on a stormy night, the kind of night where the wind howls through the trees and the rain batters against windows like a relentless drumbeat. I was driving back from the city, trying to make it home before the worst of the storm hit. My headlights barely pierced the thick curtain of rain as I navigated the winding country road. The visibility was so bad that I could hardly make out the edges of the path, just the dark, looming shapes of trees and the occasional flicker of lightning. I should have turned back, but something kept me moving forward. Maybe it was the feeling of needing to get away, to escape from the chaos of my life, my job, my debts, the constant pressure from everyone around me. My life felt like it was spiraling out of control, and I had no idea how to fix it. That's when I saw the figure on the side of the road. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me, the storm distorting shapes in the darkness. But as I got closer, I saw him more clearly. A man, standing alone, soaked to the bone, his long coat flapping in the wind. His eyes seemed to glow in the darkness, a strange, unsettling light that made me feel like he was looking straight through me. There was something about him, something that felt wrong. I slowed down, my instinct telling me to drive past, to ignore the figure and keep going. But then, he raised his hand, as if to stop me. And something about his gesture made me pull over. The man leaned into my window, his voice deep and calm, though the storm raged around us. "I can help you," he said, his eyes never leaving mine. "I know what you're struggling with, and I can give you a chance to change everything." I froze, a shiver running down my spine. "What are you talking about?" He smiled, but it wasn't a warm smile. It was the kind of smile that made my stomach turn. "You've been running for a long time, haven't you? From your mistakes. From the things you can't fix. but I can give you a way out. One chance to change everything. I swallowed hard, my heart pounding in my chest. Who are you? The man chuckled softly. Who I am doesn't matter. What matters is what I can offer you. I was confused, but something in his voice, something in his presence, drew me in. I knew deep down that I should be afraid, that I should drive away and never look back. But the desperation I felt, the weight of my failures, the debt, the broken relationships, was overwhelming. I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, ready to fall. I can offer you a deal, the man continued, his tone coaxing, almost soothing. A chance to change your life. Everything you've ever wanted, wealth, success, power. You name it, it's yours. In exchange for one thing. I stared at him, my mind racing. What do you want? He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. Your soul. For a moment, I didn't know how to respond. The air between us felt thick, heavy with the weight of his words. A part of me wanted to laugh, to tell him he was crazy, but the other part of me, the desperate part, knew he was serious. He was offering me everything I had ever dreamed of. And all I had to do was give up something I couldn't even begin to understand. I'm not going to sign anything, I said, my voice trembling. This is crazy. The man smiled again, but this time it was softer, almost pitying. It's not a contract, my friend. It's a choice. You get one shot at this. One chance to make everything right. All you have to do is say yes. I felt a strange pull toward him, an almost magnetic force. My heart raced, and for the briefest moment, I thought about it. A life where I wasn't drowning in debt, where I wasn't constantly worried about the next bill or the next failure. A life where I didn't feel like I was failing everyone around me. But then, something inside me snapped. I remembered the people I loved, the promises I'd made to them. I remembered the feeling of pride I had when I worked hard for something and earned it honestly. This wasn't the way to get what I wanted. No, I said, more firmly this time. I won't make that deal. I don't want what you're offering. The man's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of something, amusement, maybe? Very well, he said, stepping back from the car. But remember, opportunities like this don't come often. You might regret this. I started to roll up my window, but then his voice stopped me. Just know, he called, the offer remains. It always remains. And when you're ready, I'll be waiting. With that, the man turned and vanished into the storm, like he had never been there at all. I sat there for a long time, my mind spinning. Had I made the right choice? Had I turned down the chance of a lifetime? The drive home felt long, the road stretching out endlessly before me. But as I passed the place where I had seen him, I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't gotten away. That somehow, the man, the devil, was still watching me, waiting for me to change my mind. And I couldn't help but wonder, what would my life be like if I had said yes? Would it have been better? Or would I have lost something far more important than I could ever understand? I would never know. But I could feel that there was still time. The offer would always be there. And maybe, just maybe, I would take it one day. The last breath. It was just another regular Tuesday morning. The kind of day where the sun feels warmer than it should, and everything seems so ordinary that you take it for granted. I had just finished a coffee and was on my way to work, my usual route, a stretch of highway that seemed familiar and safe. The roads were slick with the early morning dew, but nothing that would have made me think twice. I wasn't in a rush. I was just going through the motions. And then it happened. One moment, I was driving, humming along to the radio, and the next, the world turned upside down. A loud screech, metal against metal, and before I could even react, my car was spinning. The air was filled with the sound of tires screeching and the crunch of metal. My body slammed against the side of the car as it twisted violently, the glass of the window shattering, the seatbelt cutting into my chest. Everything was moving too fast, yet it all seemed to happen in slow motion. My head hit something hard, a sharp pain spraying across my skull, and then everything went dark. I don't know how long I was unconscious, but when I woke, the world felt different. At first, it was the pain. It felt like my whole body had been torn apart. My ribs, my arms, my head, every inch of me was screaming in agony. I tried to move, but my limbs wouldn't respond. It was like they weren't mine anymore. Then I realized something. The sound was gone. The sound of traffic, of people, of the world, just silence. Complete silence. I tried to shout, to scream, but no sound came out. Panic began to rise in my chest. Was I dead? I turned my head slowly, fighting against the pain, and saw the wreckage of my car. The windshield was shattered, the front of the car crumpled like an accordion. I could barely make sense of it, but I knew, deep down, that I shouldn't have survived this. I shouldn't be here. But there I was. Suddenly, I felt a presence. It wasn't a sound or a voice, but a feeling. A coldness creeping up my spine. The air around me felt heavier, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was there watching me. I tried to move again, tried to pull myself out of the wreckage, but my body wouldn't obey. The pain was too much, and it felt like the world was slipping away. The edges of my vision started to blur, and for the first time, I realized I wasn't just hurt. I was dying. And then, it was like I was floating. I was no longer in my car, no longer feeling the cold metal beneath my fingertips or the unbearable pain that had once consumed me. It was like I was suspended in the air, weightless. The darkness around me was infinite, yet strangely comforting, as though it was wrapping me in a cocoon. I tried to fight it, to pull myself back, to breathe, to live. But the more I tried, the more it seemed like I was being pulled further away. It was like I was being drawn into a deep, endless ocean. I wanted to scream, to fight for my life, but my voice was gone, my body was gone, everything was fading away. Then, there was a moment of clarity. A brief flash of light in the distance, barely perceptible at first, but growing brighter. I didn't know what it was, but I felt an overwhelming sense of calm. I began to move toward it, instinctively, though I couldn't explain why. I didn't know if it was a sign, if it was something else. But before I could reach it, something stopped me. A cold hand, gripping my chest, pulling me back, forcing me to look into the darkness. It was then I heard the whisper, a voice that wasn't a voice, more of a feeling, a vibration in the air. Not yet. Not your time. I tried to fight against it, but it was too strong. I felt myself being yanked back through the darkness, back through the pain, and then, suddenly, I was gasping for air. I woke up with a start, my lungs burning, my chest heaving. I was lying on the asphalt, and the wreckage of the car was still there. But the air smelled different now, fresher, cleaner. I felt the warm rush of blood pumping through my veins, and the pain in my body was almost unbearable, but I was alive. I don't know how long I had been unconscious, or how long I had been gone. I don't even know if it was real. Was it a dream? A hallucination? But as I lay there, staring at the sky above me, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had crossed over. That I had briefly stepped into a world I wasn't meant to see. And now, every time I close my eyes, I feel that cold hand on my chest again. I hear that whisper, soft and insistent, telling me that it's not my time. But the thing is, I don't know if I ever really came back. The Ship of Shadows. It was supposed to be the vacation of a lifetime, an all-inclusive cruise to the Caribbean, the promise of sun-soaked beaches, delicious food, and endless relaxation. I had saved for months to afford this trip, dreaming of the warm waters and the gentle sway of the ship beneath me. The brochure made it look perfect, luxurious cabins, 5-star amenities, and the promise of unforgettable experiences. But as soon as I boarded the massive cruise ship, I felt something was off. The ship was unlike any I'd ever seen before. It was vast, almost too vast, with hallways that seemed to stretch on forever and grand staircases that spiraled endlessly upward. The decor was rich, but there was something cold about it, polished wood and gold accents, yet everything felt distant, like the ship had been built for a different era. I shrugged it off, attributing it to the overwhelming size of the ship, and went to my cabin. The first few days passed without incident. The weather was perfect, and the crew seemed polite and efficient, if a bit distant. But I began to notice things. Little details, almost imperceptible at first. The crew, for one, were always the same. No one seemed to age. No new staff came on board, and no one ever seemed to leave. They all had the same blank, unreadable expressions. And when you looked into their eyes, there was nothing there. Just a cold emptiness, like they weren't really human. Then, one night, while I was wandering the decks, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The sky had turned a deep crimson, the clouds swirling ominously, and I had ventured to the bow to get a better look at the storm. The ship was cutting through the waves with terrifying speed, despite the rough seas, and it felt like we were headed somewhere specific, like the ship was being guided by something unseen. I stepped out onto the deck, the wind whipping against my face. And that's when I saw them. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, shadows moving in the corners of my vision. But then I saw them clearly. Figures, tall and skeletal, standing near the edge of the deck, just beyond the reach of the light. Their faces were obscured by hoods, but I could feel their presence, cold and unnatural. They were watching me, not moving, just standing still like sentinels. My heart pounded in my chest, and I quickly turned away, hurrying back inside. The next morning, I asked one of the crew members about the figures, but they only smiled faintly, as though I had imagined it. "Don't worry, everything is fine," the crew member said with a disconcertingly blank expression. "Enjoy your stay." But that night, the unease in my stomach deepened. I began to notice that the ship seemed to be moving in strange patterns, veering off course when it should have been on the open sea. The windows of my cabin revealed nothing but a black void beyond, even though we were supposed to be surrounded by water. The only thing visible was the faint glow of strange lights on the horizon, lights that seemed to flicker and pulse, almost as though they were alive. On the fourth night, I couldn't ignore the feeling any longer. Something was terribly wrong with the ship. I snuck into the lower decks, the parts of the ship that passengers weren't meant to see. The air grew colder as I descended, and the silence was oppressive. The farther I went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became, until I reached a door, one that seemed to resist my touch at first, as if it had been sealed for centuries. I pushed through, and what I saw made my stomach lurch. The room was massive, a cavernous chamber that stretched far beyond what the ship's exterior should have allowed. The walls were lined with strange symbols, and in the center stood a massive control panel, flickering with lights and patterns I couldn't decipher. But what really caught my attention were the creatures around it, not crew members. They were tall, thin, and unnaturally still. Their skin was a shade of pale blue that seemed to shimmer in the dim light, and their eyes, those cold, soulless eyes, stared at me with a hunger that made my blood run cold. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Their presence alone was enough to make my legs tremble. The ship, I realized, wasn't just a cruise liner. It was something far older, far darker. It was a vessel, something that had been sentient for eons, an entity in itself. And it wasn't sailing through the ocean. It was pulling us somewhere far beyond the reach of Earth. Before I could move, one of the creatures turned toward me. Its thin mouth opened, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. It didn't speak, but I heard its voice in my mind, as if the thought itself was being implanted directly into my consciousness. You should not have come. Panic surged through me, and I turned to run, but the creatures moved faster than I could comprehend. Their long limbs stretched impossibly, their eyes narrowing as they began to advance on me. I fled through the narrow hallways, desperately trying to find my way back to the upper decks, but the ship seemed to shift around me, corridors twisting into unfamiliar shapes, doors leading to walls, and the feeling of being lost, trapped, seemed to grow with every passing second. Finally, I found myself standing on the deck once more. The storm had intensified, the winds howling like some ancient beast, and the waters around us seemed to rise and fall with unnatural force. The lights from the distant horizon were brighter now, and I could swear I saw shapes moving beneath the surface of the water, rising up toward us. I stumbled backward, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The ship, it wasn't just a ship anymore. It was alive. And it was not going to let us leave. The last thing I remembered before everything went black was the sound of the creature's footsteps, their cold, unblinking eyes watching me as I fell into unconsciousness. When I woke, I was back in my cabin. The storm had passed. The ship was calm again. But there was no longer a crew. No passengers. Only an empty, quiet ship. I don't know what happened to everyone else. I don't know if they were taken, or if they're still here, somewhere, hidden away in the bowels of this ship. I've tried to leave, to jump overboard, but no matter how hard I try, the ship never stops moving. It never docks. The ship belongs to them now. To the creatures. And I'm just another passenger. A ghost, drifting through the endless, haunted sea. The scales beneath the surface. I had always considered myself a rational person, practical, grounded in reality. But the events of the past few months have shattered that belief in ways I can't explain. It started as a simple job. I worked as a security consultant for a high-tech research facility, a building on the outskirts of the city. The company was well known for its work in bioengineering, and they had recently been funded to conduct some classified experiments. My job was to install the latest security systems and make sure everything ran smoothly. Nothing out of the ordinary until it started. It was late one night, well past midnight, when I first noticed the strange behavior of the employees. I had stayed late to finish a few security updates, and as I walked down one of the hallways, I noticed an unusual silence. The usual hum of activity, the faint buzz of machinery, had stopped. The facility, which should have been bustling with people, was eerily still. I stopped by the security office to check the cameras, only to find that several of the monitors had gone black. I assumed it was a glitch, so I began checking the connections. That's when I heard it. A low, hissing sound echoed from down the hall. At first, I thought it was just the sound of the air conditioning. But the longer I listened, the clearer it became. It was a breath, wet and heavy. Then, a faint scraping sound, like claws running along metal. My heart skipped a beat. I was alone. Or so I thought. I grabbed my flashlight and made my way down the hall, my footsteps echoing in the silence. The further I went, the colder it became. A sense of dread washed over me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I turned a corner, and that's when I saw them. At first, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me, but no, it was real. There, in the dim light, I saw a figure, tall, slender, its skin shimmering in the low light, covered in scales that glistened like dark emeralds. Its eyes were large, yellow, and slit like a snake's, and its head had a subtle but unmistakable angular shape, almost like a lizard. For a moment, I froze. My brain couldn't comprehend what I was seeing. Was it a person in a costume? Some kind of elaborate prank? But no, the movement was too fluid, too alien. This creature wasn't human. It didn't see me at first, but I could feel its presence, the way it loomed in the shadows, its gaze fixed on something just out of my sight. Its tongue flicked out, tasting the air, and I instinctively took a step back, but the floor creaked under my weight. The creature's head snapped in my direction, its eyes locking onto mine with a predatory gaze. It hissed, its teeth sharp and white, like those of a serpent, as it began to move toward me. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest, but my legs felt like they were made of lead. I turned and ran. I don't remember how I made it to the security room, but I locked myself inside, gasping for breath. My hands were shaking as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. My mind raced, trying to convince myself that I had imagined it, that it was a product of stress, exhaustion, or maybe some malfunction in the facility's lighting. But deep down, I knew the truth. There was something down there, something that didn't belong. The next morning, I went to report what I had seen, but when I arrived, the place was bustling with activity. The employees were back to their usual routines. No one seemed to notice anything unusual. And the footage from the security cameras? All gone. There was nothing on the tapes, not a single frame that showed anything out of the ordinary. I tried to leave, but the company wouldn't let me. They told me I was imagining things, that I had been overworked. They reassured me that nothing was wrong. But I couldn't shake the feeling that they were hiding something, something they didn't want anyone to know. Days turned into weeks, and I continued to work there, but I was no longer the same. I became paranoid, always looking over my shoulder, feeling eyes on me even while I was alone. I could sense them now, those creatures lurking just beneath the surface, always watching, always waiting. The employees, too. I began to notice things I hadn't before. Their movements, their speech, it was different. Unnatural. And sometimes, when they thought no one was looking, I would catch glimpses of their eyes, yellow, slit-eyed, cold, and alien. I had to leave. But no matter how much I tried to escape, something always pulled me back. It was as if the facility had a hold on me, an invisible tether keeping me there. I tried to gather evidence, but every time I thought I had something, it vanished. Files were deleted. Photos erased. It was like the creatures, the reptoids, had infiltrated everything. Control was no longer in human hands. I don't know how much time has passed since that night. Days? Weeks? Months? All I know is that I can't escape them. The reptiloids are real, and they're here, hidden in plain sight, walking among us. They wear human skins, blend in with the crowd, but their true nature is always lurking just beneath the surface. And they are waiting for the right moment to take over completely. I don't know if anyone else sees them. Maybe they do. But I can't trust anyone anymore. The moment I let my guard down, it'll be too late. So now, I keep my eyes open, watching for the telltale signs, the flicker of the tongue, the gleam of the eye. I don't know what their endgame is, but I know one thing for sure, I'm not safe. None of us are. The Ghost of Marlowe. I never believed in ghosts, at least, not until I encountered the one that would haunt me for the rest of my life. It all started when I was assigned to a small, crumbling estate on the outskirts of Marlowe, a sleepy village known for its centuries-old history. The estate had been abandoned for decades, the house a decaying shell of its former grandeur. As a young architect just starting my career, I saw this job as a challenge, a chance to prove myself. The plan was simple: restore the house, preserve its historical charm, and prepare it for sale. The first day was uneventful. The house had an air of neglect, dust covering every surface and the floorboards creaking underfoot. But there was something else, a strange heaviness in the air, a feeling that lingered in the rooms long after I left. I dismissed it as my imagination, a byproduct of working alone in such an eerie place. It wasn't until the second night that I started to notice something unusual. I stayed late, sketching designs for the renovations, when I heard it, a faint sound, like a whisper, coming from upstairs. I froze, listening. There was no one else in the house. I told myself it was just the wind, the house settling, or maybe the sound of the old pipes. I ignored it and went back to my work. But it happened again the next night. This time, the whispering was louder, more distinct. It was coming from the second-floor hallway, just outside the door to the master bedroom. My heart raced, but I convinced myself it was nothing more than an old house creaking. The thought of being in such a large, empty place alone played tricks on my mind. That night, I made the decision to investigate. I grabbed a flashlight, determined to find the source of the sound. As I reached the top of the stairs, the temperature seemed to drop, and I could see my breath in the cold air. The whispering had stopped, but an uncomfortable silence filled the hallway. I walked to the master bedroom door, my hand trembling as I reached for the knob. It was locked, but it had a peculiar weight to it, almost as if someone was holding it from the other side. I turned the knob again, this time with more force. The door creaked open slowly, and I stepped inside. The room was freezing, the window cracked just enough to let in a cold breeze. I swept the flashlight across the room, my eyes searching the dark corners. And then I saw it. In the far corner, by the fireplace, a figure stood. It was tall, draped in dark, tattered clothing, and its face was obscured, as though covered by a veil of mist. I couldn't make out any features, only a vague silhouette. My heart pounded in my chest, and my throat tightened with fear. The figure didn't move, just stood there, watching me. I should have run, but something rooted me to the spot. I was paralyzed, unable to look away. Then, in a voice that sent chills down my spine, the figure spoke. "You shouldn't be here," it whispered, its voice echoing through the room as if it came from all directions. "You should have left when you had the chance." The air grew colder, and the walls seemed to close in around me. Panic surged through my veins as I turned to flee, but the door slammed shut behind me with a deafening bang. I screamed, pounding on the door, but no one could hear me. The whispering returned, this time louder, more insistent. It felt like the very walls of the house were alive, pressing in on me, suffocating me. After what seemed like an eternity, the door finally opened. I rushed out, barely able to catch my breath. I didn't look back as I ran down the stairs and out of the house, into the cold night air. The next morning, I tried to make sense of what had happened. I returned to the estate, but the room where I had encountered the figure was empty, as if nothing had ever happened. The whispers, the cold, the figure, they were gone. I told myself it had been a hallucination, a trick of the mind. But deep down, I knew better. There was something in that house, something that had been waiting for me. The strange occurrences continued, night after night, whispers in the walls, doors that opened and closed by themselves, objects that moved while I wasn't looking. And always, the figure of the shadowed man in the master bedroom, standing in the corner, waiting. I eventually learned the truth from an old woman in the village. The house had once belonged to a man named Charles Marlowe, a wealthy landowner with a reputation for cruelty. He had disappeared under mysterious circumstances many years ago, leaving the estate to fall into ruin. It was said that his spirit lingered in the house, forever bound to the place where he had committed his darkest deeds. Now, I was his prisoner. Marlowe's ghost had marked me, and no matter how far I ran, I couldn't escape. His whispers followed me everywhere, haunting my every step, his cold touch on my skin. The more I tried to leave, the more I felt his presence tightening around me, suffocating me. And now, I am here, in the very same room where I first saw him, writing this down as a warning to anyone who might be foolish enough to set foot in this cursed place. You see, Marlowe's ghost doesn't just haunt the house. He haunts the people who try to escape him. And when he finally has you, there's no going back. The headphones that transmit the voices of the dead. I bought them on whim. It wasn't a special occasion or anything. I just walked past a street vendor one rainy afternoon, and there they were, tucked in a dusty corner of his cart. They looked old, almost antique, with fraying leather and a faded logo that had long since worn off. The vendor claimed they were special, but I was too intrigued to care about his vague sales pitch. The price was too low to ignore, so I handed him the money without hesitation. From the moment I put them on, things felt wrong. The first time I used them, it was nothing extraordinary. I just plugged them into my phone, scrolled through my playlist, and pressed play. The usual crackling sound filled my ears before the music started. But then, amidst the usual static and distorted notes, I heard something faint, too soft to ignore, too real to be a glitch. A voice. At first, I thought it was just my imagination or perhaps a problem with the headphones. But the more I listened, the clearer it became. The voice wasn't speaking to me, it was speaking through me. Like it was trapped in the sound of the music, trying to break free. I pulled the headphones off and looked at them, half expecting to see something unnatural about them. But there was nothing. No wires loose, no signs of damage. They were just old, worn, and strangely alive. That night, I couldn't sleep. The voice, soft but insistent, lingered in my mind. It wasn't the kind of voice you'd expect to hear in your head. It sounded distant, almost echoing, like it was coming from far away or from behind a thick fog. It repeated the same thing over and over. Help me, please. Don't let them take me. I brushed it off as a product of too much stress. The next day, I tried again, thinking the voice had been a one-time occurrence. This time, I played a podcast instead of music, hoping for something more straightforward. As I slipped the headphones on, I expected nothing unusual. But when the host's voice faded into the background, I heard it again, clearer this time. I'm lost. Please, I need you. Please help me. My heart raced. This time, it was unmistakable. The voice wasn't just in my head, it was coming from the headphones, and it was begging for something I couldn't understand. Panicked, I yanked them off again, but the voices didn't stop. They echoed in my mind, swirling like an awful, haunting melody. The next night, I decided to experiment. I turned on a white noise track, the kind that's supposed to help you sleep, hoping it would drown out whatever was happening. As the static filled the room, I felt a strange pressure, a sort of heaviness in the air. The voices intensified. They weren't just whispers anymore. They were screaming. Help! Help me! They're coming! Don't let them get me! I could feel my pulse quicken, and a cold sweat broke out over my skin. The voices became more frantic with each passing moment. They were different voices, some high-pitched, others low and guttural. Each one was frantic, desperate. But they all seemed to be saying the same thing. I pressed the headphones to my ears harder, trying to block it out, but it was no use. The voices were everywhere. I couldn't take it anymore. I tried to throw the headphones across the room, but they wouldn't leave. Every time I pulled them off, the voices followed, growing louder and more chaotic. They're coming. Don't let them find you. Don't. I heard a soft click, and suddenly, I was no longer in my room. It was as if I was somewhere else, somewhere dark and empty, with nothing but the sound of those voices. I looked around frantically, trying to see where I was, but I couldn't. It was just darkness, pressing in from all sides. And then, from the depths of the blackness, a figure emerged. At first, it was a shadow, flickering in and out of existence, but then it solidified, a tall, thin shape with hollow eyes and a mouth that was wide open, its face contorted in agony. The figure reached out to me, its fingers elongated and skeletal, and it spoke. Its voice was like 1,000 others, layered over each other, speaking in unison. We were all forgotten. You have to help us. You have to stop it from taking us. I screamed and ripped the headphones from my ears, stumbling backward into the safety of my own reality. But the voices, they still echoed. They didn't fade. They remained, buried in the corners of my mind. I never put the headphones on again. I tried to get rid of them, but they always seemed to find their way back to me, like some sort of cursed object that refused to be discarded. I thought about burning them, smashing them to pieces, but something inside me held back. What if, in doing so, I let something far worse out? For now, they remain on the shelf. Silent. Waiting. I can still hear the voices if I listen closely, but I no longer dare. I don't know where the voices come from. Maybe they're the lost souls of the dead, trapped in the static of the headphones, or maybe there's something far darker. Whatever the case, I've learned one thing. Some things, once they've entered your mind, can never truly leave. The Neighbor Killer. It was a quiet neighborhood, one of those suburban areas where everyone knew each other's names and the lawns were always meticulously trimmed. the kind of place where nothing ever really happened. But that all changed when I moved into the house next door to him. His name was Henry. He was older than the rest of the neighbors, quiet and a bit reclusive. He didn't keep much of a garden, and his house always seemed a little darker than the others, but nothing that would raise any red flags. I never thought much of it, not at first. After all, in a neighborhood like ours, the most exciting thing you'd get was a new dog walking down the street or a kid's lemonade stand. I was just another one of those anonymous faces passing through, trying to make a life in the city. The first few months of living here were uneventful, but then I started to notice strange things about Henry. He had a routine that he'd followed religiously. He'd wake up at exactly 6 in the morning, just as the sun was coming up, and take a walk around the block. I never thought too much about it until one evening when I saw him returning home earlier than usual, carrying a large, heavy bag. It wasn't the kind of bag you expect someone to have after a morning walk. It was bulky and made a faint, unsettling noise as it shifted in his hands. He didn't look at me when I waved. He just kept walking straight to his door, his face shadowed by his unkempt gray hair. I didn't think much of it, figuring it was probably just another weird hobby, or maybe he picked up something heavy from the trash or a yard sale. But things started to escalate after that. At night, I would hear noises from Henry's house, scraping sounds, like furniture being pushed around or something heavy being dragged across the floor. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, but the sound seemed too deliberate, too rhythmic. I could never make out what it was, but I found myself straining to listen, hoping for some kind of explanation. But nothing ever came. One night, I decided to bring it up casually to a neighbor while walking my dog. Mrs. Jacobs, the woman who lived across the street, had lived in the neighborhood for years. She always seemed to know everyone's business, so I thought she might have some insight into Henry's odd behavior. "Have you noticed anything strange about Henry?" I asked, trying to sound nonchalant. Mrs. Jacobs gave me a strange look, like she wasn't sure how to answer. Then, her expression darkened. "Don't you know?" she whispered. "Henry's the one who lives alone because his wife, well, she disappeared years ago. No one really talks about it, but it's the kind of thing you don't forget in a place like this. People say he had something to do with it." I felt a chill run down my spine. I'd heard the rumor before, but I didn't know how to process it. I didn't want to believe it, but the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. Henry was a man who seemed to thrive on isolation, someone who avoided all social contact, who always kept to himself. And then there were the strange sounds from his house, the dragging, the scraping. The next few days were a blur of paranoia. I watched Henry more closely, noting the way he would leave his house at odd hours, only to return with that same heavy, ominous bag. It was impossible not to feel a sense of dread every time he walked past. But it wasn't until that one night that everything changed. It was well after midnight, and I was sitting in my living room, unable to sleep. That's when I heard it, loud thumps coming from Henry's house. It sounded like something, or someone, was struggling. The noise was so intense, I could hear it through the walls. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just another odd sound from his house, but then I heard it again, a scream. It was unmistakable. A real, human scream. My heart raced. I grabbed my phone and called the police, telling them everything I had heard. I wasn't sure if they believed me, but I couldn't ignore it. There was a real chance that someone needed help. The police arrived within minutes, their sirens screaming through the night. I watched from my window as they stormed into Henry's house, the flashlights from their torches cutting through the dark. I could see them searching the yard, calling out for someone, and when they finally broke into the basement, they found what I'd been too terrified to consider. Henry wasn't just a quiet neighbor. He was a murderer. The heavy bag he'd been carrying wasn't filled with junk. Inside, they found the remains of his wife, the one who had disappeared all those years ago. The police later learned that Henry had kept her body hidden in his basement, preserving it as if she were still alive. The scraping noises were from when he would move her body around, trying to keep up the illusion that she was still with him. But it didn't stop there. When they searched further, they discovered something even more horrifying, a small room in the back of his basement, lined with photographs of other missing people, all of them connected to Henry in some way. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. Henry had been living in his own twisted world, where no one had questioned him, where he was allowed to keep his secrets hidden away. The screams I had heard weren't just from his wife, they were from every person who had been unlucky enough to catch his eye. Now, when I look at Henry's house, I can't shake the feeling that it's not truly empty. I can't help but wonder if his victims still linger, trapped in the same place they were taken from. The house, like Henry, has been abandoned. But the memory of what happened there, it won't ever leave. The people beneath. I had heard stories about the old subway tunnels, the ones no longer in use. The ones that were sealed off decades ago, hidden beneath the city like a forgotten secret. People whispered about them in hushed tones, saying they were haunted, that strange things happened down there, and anyone who went looking never came back the same. But, being a curious person, I didn't believe in ghosts or urban legends. I thought there must be some rational explanation for the rumors. After all, it was just an old subway system, right? I was wrong. It all started one evening while I was working late. I'd been staying in the city for a while, far from home, trying to adjust to the hectic pace of life here. My job at the architectural firm kept me in the office long after dark, and I'd often be the last one left. On this particular night, the building was silent, the usual hum of voices and phones replaced by the eerie quiet that only comes when everyone's gone. I was wrapping up a project, my eyes tired, when I received a message from my colleague, Dave. Got a lead on something. Meet me at the old subway station. The entrance is still there. The message was cryptic, but Dave had always been the adventurous type. He was always looking for a challenge, a mystery to solve. So, when he sent me a message like that, I couldn't resist. I locked up my office and headed out into the cold night air, the city lights flickering overhead. The old subway station was a few blocks away, hidden beneath a set of abandoned buildings. It had been out of service for years, long before I even moved to the city. There was a heavy metal door, covered in graffiti and rust, barely noticeable if you weren't looking for it. Dave was already there, waiting by the entrance, a grin on his face like he had just uncovered something incredible. "You're not gonna believe what I found," he said, his voice hushed, though there was a sense of excitement in it. "Where are we going?" I asked, feeling a slight unease settle in. The air around the door seemed cold, even though the night itself wasn't that chilly. "The tunnels," Dave said. "There's a part that wasn't closed off. I've been exploring a little, but it's different down there. You'll see." I hesitated, but curiosity got the better of me. I followed him through the rusted door, and we descended down a narrow flight of stairs into the darkness below. The moment we stepped into the station, I felt it, an unsettling sensation, like we weren't supposed to be there. The air was thick, damp, and stale, and the walls were covered in layers of grime and peeling paint. The faint smell of mildew lingered in the air, but there was something else too, something that made my skin crawl. Dave pulled out a flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness. We walked through the cavernous station, our footsteps echoing against the walls. The platform was covered in debris, abandoned tickets, and broken signs scattered across the floor. It was like stepping into a time capsule from the past, but it didn't feel abandoned. It felt alive. "This way," Dave said, pointing to a narrow hallway that led deeper underground. The tunnel seemed to stretch endlessly, the walls narrow and cracked, like the very structure itself was barely holding on. I followed him down the path, my nerves on edge as the air grew colder, heavier. As we walked, I began to hear something, whispers, distant murmurs that seemed to come from all around us. I froze, straining my ears, but Dave didn't seem to notice. He was too focused on something further down the tunnel, his eyes glinting with an almost manic excitement. "I've been down here before," he said, glancing back at me. "But there's a part of the tunnel no one talks about. The station was built over an older structure, you see. A hidden one. People lived down here. They were abandoned. Some say they still do." I frowned, feeling a chill creep up my spine. "What are you talking about? People?" Before he could answer, the whispers grew louder, more distinct. It was a low, guttural sound that sent a shiver through my body. I turned my head, looking for the source, but saw nothing in the darkness. My heart began to race. Then, without warning, the ground beneath us trembled. The entire tunnel seemed to shift, and the lights flickered wildly, casting eerie shadows across the walls. I felt the pressure in my chest grow, like the very air was suffocating me. And that's when I saw them, figures, standing at the edges of the light. They were human-like, but twisted, their faces gaunt and pale, their eyes hollow, reflecting the flashlight's beam with a sickly sheen. "Dave," I whispered, my voice shaking. "Where are they?" But Dave didn't answer. He stood frozen in place, his eyes wide with terror. The figures started to move toward us, slowly at first, then faster, their movements jerky and unnatural, like they were stumbling out of a nightmare. They were covered in rags, their skin stretched tight over bones, and their hands reached toward us with outstretched fingers, their mouths open in silent screams. I grabbed Dave by the arm and tried to pull him back, but he was limp, as though frozen by some unseen force. My heart pounded in my chest as I stumbled backward, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The whispers grew louder, turning into frantic, disjointed words that echoed through my mind. "Run, they're coming." I didn't need to be told twice. I turned and sprinted down the tunnel, dragging Dave along with me, desperate to escape the nightmare we had stumbled into. But the tunnel stretched on, and the figures were closing in, their hollow eyes fixed on us. The deeper we ran, the more the walls seemed to shift, as if the very space around us was warping. It felt like we were trapped in a maze, a labyrinth with no way out. Finally, we reached the staircase, gasping for air, the figures still just behind us. As we scrambled up the stairs and out into the night, the whispers faded, but the fear remained. The door slammed shut behind us, and we stood there in the dark, breathing heavily, the silence deafening. We never spoke of it again. I don't know what's down there, beneath the city. But I know this much, the people who once lived in those tunnels, they didn't leave. And I'm not sure they ever will. The Searcher. I never expected to be back in the game. After 25 years as a police officer, I retired. The pension was good, and I'd earned my peace. My life had slowed down, long walks in the park, a cup of coffee every morning at the same diner, evenings watching old movies. The chaos of the city was a distant memory, and I had no intention of diving back into the world I'd left behind. But, of course, life has a way of surprising you. It all started one chilly Thursday morning. I was sitting at my usual spot in the diner when I saw the familiar face of a former colleague, Detective Jameson. He waved, and I waved back, motioning for him to join me. I wasn't in the mood to talk police business, but I didn't want to be rude either. "Got a favor to ask," he said, sitting down across from me, his brow furrowed. Jameson had always had a look of constant worry on his face, but today it was different. It was the kind of worry you can't shake off. "I'm retired, Jameson." "I thought we were done with this," I replied, taking a sip of my coffee. "I know. But this one's different," he said, his voice low. "It's personal." I raised an eyebrow, the word personal always catching my attention. He pulled out a small folder from his jacket and slid it across the table. It was thin, just a few pages, but I could tell it had weight to it. I opened it. The first page was a photo of a woman, mid-30s, long dark hair, a soft smile. Nothing too remarkable. But underneath her photo was something that made my heart skip, a name I recognized. "Jenna Harris," I muttered under my breath. I had worked a case with her years ago. She was a witness to a robbery, and the case had been far more complicated than it appeared. Jenna had given us a statement, but afterward, I never heard from her again. She disappeared from the police radar, like many others do. Jameson sighed, looking tired. "She's missing. Again. Her family is scared, and the department's too stretched to give it proper attention. I know you've got the skills, Jack. You're the best tracker we had." I studied the photo. Jenna's disappearance didn't make sense. She had disappeared once before, but we thought that was just her trying to escape something in her past. Now it seemed there was something more to it, something darker. I rubbed my temples, the memories flooding back. The case, the tension, the feeling that there were things we didn't know. It had been a strange time, full of twists and turns that left us all wondering what was really going on behind the scenes. I had brushed it off as one of those strange coincidences the job brought. But now, it seemed like it was coming back to haunt me. "All right. I'll help. But I don't know what I'll find," I said, my voice steady. "Where do I start?" Jameson nodded, sliding the folder over to me. "I'll send you the address where she was last seen. It's an old apartment building on the east side. Her parents said she was staying with a friend there. But when they tried to visit, it was empty. No one has seen her in 2 weeks." I grabbed my jacket and stood up. "I'll check it out." The building was in a part of the city I wasn't familiar with. The street was quieter than I expected, with only a few cars parked along the curb and a couple of people walking briskly to wherever they had to be. I looked up at the apartment building, its windows dark and empty, like a shell of something that had once been full of life. It had an abandoned feel, though it clearly wasn't. I made my way inside, the worn-out steps creaking beneath my boots. The air was thick with the smell of old wood and dust. The hallways were narrow, the lights flickering as I walked past the doors, each one slightly ajar, as though someone had left in a hurry. I knocked on the door to apartment 3B, the last place Jenna had been seen. There was no answer. I knocked again, more forcefully this time. Still nothing. I tried the handle. It was unlocked. The apartment was small, sparsely furnished. A couch sat in the middle of the room, a few chairs scattered around, a table covered in papers and magazines. Everything looked untouched, almost as if the place had been abandoned long ago. But then I noticed something odd. There were 2 cups on the coffee table. One was half empty, the other still full. It was as if someone had just been sitting there, talking, and then had left in a hurry. I stepped further inside, scanning the room. Nothing seemed out of place until I noticed the closet door slightly open. I hesitated before pushing it fully open, but when I did, I felt a chill run down my spine. There, on the floor, was a small pile of clothing, but no sign of Jenna. What caught my attention, though, was a folded piece of paper sitting on top of the clothes. I unfolded it carefully. The writing was hurried, frantic, as if someone had written it in a rush. They're watching me. They know I've seen something. I have to get out, but they won't let me. Don't trust the building. Don't trust anyone. My blood ran cold as I reread the words. Jenna had known something that made her disappear. I pocketed the note and left the apartment, my mind racing. Something wasn't right, and the more I thought about it, the more I realized that I had seen this kind of thing before. People who knew too much, who were too close to the truth, they always ended up missing. I didn't know where this would lead, but I knew one thing. I wasn't going to stop until I found out what had happened to Jenna. As I walked back to my car, the weight of the note pressing in my pocket, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. There was something in the shadows, something just out of view, that didn't want me to uncover the truth. And that thought lingered in my mind as I drove off into the night, knowing that the search had only just begun. The Watcher of the Underground. I first noticed him a week ago, though I didn't think much of it at the time. It was just another late evening on the metro, crowded as usual with commuters returning home after a long day. The lights hummed softly overhead, and the rhythmic clatter of the train on the tracks was oddly soothing. I had just found a seat near the door when I saw him. He was standing in the corner, his head slightly tilted as though he were lost in thought. His face was unreadable, pale, and framed by dark hair. He didn't look like the type who'd attract attention, just another tired man in a long coat, blending into the sea of strangers. But then, something shifted. He wasn't just blending in. He was watching. At first, it was subtle. His eyes didn't linger on anyone for too long, but his gaze was always fixed. It swept across the passengers, stopping for a moment, then moving on. He was studying us, carefully, methodically. I didn't know why, but it made my skin crawl. The next day, I saw him again. It was the same time, the same station, the same train. This time, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was following me. I tried not to glance in his direction, but it was impossible not to. He was there, as he had been before, watching. His eyes never left the crowd, as if he were searching for someone or something. I couldn't tell if he was looking for a specific person or simply taking note of all the people around him. It was as if we were all part of some twisted experiment, and he was the observer. By the third day, it became a pattern. Each evening, he was there, in the same corner, eyes scanning, never blinking. There was something almost hypnotic about the way he moved his gaze across the crowd, like he was absorbing details. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe he was just another tired commuter, zoned out from the monotony of the ride. But the feeling in the pit of my stomach told me otherwise. One evening, as the train pulled into the station, I noticed something strange. The doors opened and people began to shuffle out, but he didn't move. He stayed in place, eyes fixed on the crowd as though waiting for something. Or someone. My heart started to race. I felt a shiver crawl down my spine, my hands suddenly cold. There were only a few people left on the train. I looked around. There was a man standing near the doors, his back turned. The watcher's eyes locked onto him. It was then that I realized the truth. He wasn't watching everyone. He was following someone. That man by the doors wasn't just another commuter. He was the target. I stood up, my mind reeling. I had to leave. I had to get off the train before whatever was about to happen did. But as the doors started to close, my eyes met the watcher's. The briefest flicker of recognition passed between us, and for a moment, I felt like I was suffocating. His gaze wasn't just cold, it was predatory, like he had known exactly what I was thinking. I backed away, my heart pounding. The doors slammed shut behind me as I stepped off the train, trying to shake off the feeling of being hunted. The watcher's gaze lingered in my mind, the feeling of his eyes on me still burning. The next day, I couldn't get the image of him out of my head. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, just my imagination running wild. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw his pale face, and I heard the sound of his footsteps following me. I knew, deep down, that I wasn't imagining it. He had been following me. And now, he was getting closer. That night, I didn't take the metro. I couldn't. I stayed home, locked the doors, pulled the blinds shut, and tried to forget the feeling of his eyes on me. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw him in the corner, watching, waiting. It's been 3 days since then. And now, I'm not sure if I'll ever be able to leave my apartment again without seeing him lurking in the shadows, his cold eyes following me wherever I go. I don't know what he wants. I don't know who or what he's waiting for. But I do know one thing, he's still out there, somewhere. Watching. Waiting. The glass tower. I've never been the superstitious type, but there are moments in life that you can't explain. Moments that make you question everything you thought you knew. This is one of those moments. It started with the building. I had passed it 100 times before without ever giving it a second thought. A tall, glass tower standing on the edge of the city, its windows reflecting the changing sky like a giant mirror. I had always thought it looked out of place, like something from a different time, but I never questioned it. Until one evening, when I found myself standing outside it, waiting for the bus. It was late, too late for most people to be out, and the streets were almost empty. I glanced up at the tower, its lights flickering inside like the building was alive, pulsing with some kind of strange energy. That's why I saw it. A flash of movement behind one of the top floor windows. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. But when I looked again, there it was, a shadow, moving across the room. I couldn't explain why, but I felt drawn to it. Something about the way the shadow moved, fluid and unnatural, made my pulse quicken. The next evening, I found myself standing outside the building again. This time, I wasn't waiting for the bus, I was waiting for something else. I watched as the lights inside flickered on and off, just like the night before. And there it was again. The same shadow, darting across the room. But this time, it was followed by something else, another figure, this one more solid, more real. My heart pounded in my chest as I took a step forward, my curiosity getting the best of me. I knew I shouldn't have been so close to the building, but I couldn't help myself. The windows were large, and the view inside was clear. What I saw inside made me freeze. There were people, or at least, they looked like people. But their movements were wrong. They moved too quickly, too jerkily, as if they weren't human at all. Some of them were sitting at desks, but they didn't seem to be working. They were just staring at the walls, unmoving, their eyes wide open in that same strange, blank expression. Others were walking around, but their steps were erratic, like they were being pulled by invisible strings. I wanted to look away, to convince myself it was just an illusion, but I couldn't. Something kept me rooted to the spot, unable to tear my gaze away from the horror unfolding before me. And then, as if they sensed me watching, the figures turned in unison. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I was sure they could see me, even though I was standing outside on the street, miles away from them. Their eyes, those cold, empty eyes, stared straight into mine. A chill ran through me. I took a step back, my heart hammering in my chest. That's when I heard the sound, a low, guttural hum that seemed to come from the building itself. It was a sound I couldn't describe, but it felt like it was vibrating inside me, pulling me closer. I don't know what happened next. My mind went blank. One moment, I was standing there, staring up at the tower, and the next, I was inside. The door to the building was wide open, as if it had been waiting for me. I stepped inside, the air cool and sterile, and the hum grew louder, vibrating in my bones. The hallways were dimly lit, the only light coming from flickering fluorescent bulbs. The walls were lined with strange symbols I didn't recognize, but that somehow felt familiar. Like I had seen them before, in a dream or somewhere far away. I wandered through the building, drawn by an invisible force, my footsteps echoing in the silence. The further I went, the stranger the building became. The windows, once clear, were now covered in grime and dust, obscuring the view outside. The rooms were empty, their furniture overturned, as if they had been abandoned in a hurry. But in the back of my mind, I knew I wasn't alone. I heard them before I saw them. The figures. The ones from the windows. They were here, in the building with me. Moving in the shadows, their bodies contorted in unnatural ways. They were all around me, watching, waiting. The same blank, lifeless expressions on their faces, the same jerky, erratic movements. And then, I saw it, the source of the hum. A room at the end of the hallway. It was bathed in a sickly green light, and the door was slightly ajar. I couldn't stop myself. I walked toward it, my feet moving of their own accord. As I stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind me, and I was plunged into darkness. The air was thick, heavy, and suffocating. I could hear the figures moving around me, but I couldn't see them. My pulse raced, and I tried to scream, but no sound escaped my lips. And then, from the darkness, a voice whispered, "You shouldn't have come here." I don't remember what happened after that. The next thing I knew, I was standing outside the building, the lights in the windows now completely dark. My hands were shaking, my clothes damp with sweat. I looked around, confused, trying to piece together what had just happened. But the building was gone. It was as if it had never been there. The street was empty, the place where the tower once stood was now just a vacant lot, the ground untouched, as though the building had never existed. I don't know if I imagined it. I don't know if I'm losing my mind. But every night since, I can't shake the feeling that something is still watching me. That something is still waiting for me to come back. And no matter how hard I try to forget, I can't escape the memory of the glass tower and the strange, twisted figures that moved within it. I don't know what the building was or who or what those figures were. But I do know this: some things are better left unseen. The mirage above. I've spent most of my life in the military, training for scenarios that rarely come to pass. We're always prepared for the worst, drilled on every tactic, every strategy. But nothing in my training could have prepared me for what happened during one routine exercise when I saw something I couldn't explain. It started as an ordinary day. The sun was high, the heat thick in the desert air. We were out on a training field just outside the base, running through a mock combat scenario. My unit was scattered around the rocky terrain, taking cover behind boulders and shrubs. I was crouched low, moving cautiously toward the next checkpoint when I first noticed it. At first, I thought it was just the heat playing tricks on my eyes. A shimmering, like a mirage, floating just above the ground. It was a blur at first, too far to make out clearly. But the closer I got, the more distinct it became. I stopped in my tracks, my breath catching in my throat. The air above the ground rippled as though it were alive, warping and twisting unnaturally, like some kind of invisible force was distorting it. I wasn't the only one who saw it. I glanced around, catching the confused expressions on my comrades' faces. They, too, had stopped in their tracks, squinting into the distance, trying to make sense of the disturbance. The usual sounds of the desert, the dry rustling of wind through sand, the faint hum of radio chatter, seemed to fade into a distant hum as the strange phenomenon in the sky grew more pronounced. I took a step forward, instinctively reaching for my binoculars. Through the lenses, I could see it more clearly now. Something was hovering in the air, just above the rippling ground. It looked like a figure, or maybe a craft, but it was distorted. A shadowy blur, flickering in and out of focus, as if it was caught between dimensions. The more I stared, the less it made sense. It wasn't a plane, it wasn't a bird, it was something else entirely. My heart raced, and a chill ran through me despite the heat. I wasn't sure whether to call it in, whether anyone would believe me. But before I could make a decision, the figure began to move. It wasn't a smooth motion like a plane or drone would make. It flickered, jumped, and shifted positions almost instantly, like it was teleported from one point to another in the blink of an eye. My mind struggled to process what I was seeing, but the unease I felt in the pit of my stomach told me this wasn't just some malfunctioning drone or an experimental aircraft. This was something different. I pulled my radio to my mouth, the static crackling in my ear as I tried to make contact with my commanding officer. "Command, this is Bravo Team. Do you copy?" I spoke, my voice shaky. "We've got an unidentified object in the sky. Something is, it's not normal." There was a brief pause, then the voice of my CO crackled back through the static. "Bravo Team, you're seeing things. Probably a glitch in the equipment. Stay on mission and move out." But I couldn't shake it. The object, whatever it was now hovering just above us, moving slowly in erratic patterns, circling like a predator. It wasn't a glitch. It was real. It was right there in front of me, and I could feel it watching us. "Command, I'm not sure this is a glitch," I said, my voice more urgent now. "It's still there. It's hovering, moving erratically. Something is wrong." But again, there was only static on the line. I didn't know what to do. My training kicked in, and I dropped to my knees, trying to stay low, to not draw attention. But no matter how hard I tried to ignore it, I couldn't. The thing above us was too unnatural, too wrong. My pulse quickened, my breath shallow. And then, in an instant, it vanished. 1 second, it was there, hovering and flickering in the air, and the next, it was gone, no sound, no explosion, nothing. Just an empty sky, the desert stretching out beneath it, as though it had never been there. I sat there for what felt like hours, just staring into the sky, waiting for it to reappear. But it didn't. My comrades, still crouched in cover, looked around in confusion. They hadn't seen what I saw. To them, everything seemed normal. We completed the exercise, finished the drill as if nothing had happened, but the whole time, I felt this gnawing sense of dread, a feeling that something was wrong. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was an experimental aircraft, or a malfunctioning drone. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the answer. It's been days since the exercise, but I can't shake the feeling. I've been checking the skies, scanning for any sign of that strange figure. But every time I look up, I see nothing but the same blue sky I've always known. And yet, I can't forget what I saw. I don't know what it was, but I do know one thing, it wasn't a glitch. And it's still out there, somewhere, waiting. The labyrinth of the back door. I never liked the old house. The house itself wasn't much to look at, just a 2-story building on the edge of town with cracked paint and an overgrown yard. My parents had bought it when I was young, but I never felt at ease there. Something about the house always seemed off, as though it was hiding something from us. But it was my childhood home, so I learned to ignore the little things, the creaking of the floorboards, the flickering lights, the strange feeling of being watched while I was alone. It was the back door that always unsettled me the most. It wasn't much of a door. Just a simple wooden thing, slightly warped with age. But there was something about it, the way it was always cooler to the touch than the rest of the house, the way it seemed to groan under pressure, like it was trying to keep something locked away. We never used it. We'd go in and out through the front door, which was more convenient. But I often wondered why the back door was so separate, and why no one ever mentioned it. When I was older, after moving out and returning briefly to stay with my parents, I finally decided to confront it. I had been sitting in the kitchen one evening, mindlessly sipping on a cup of tea, when I heard the faint sound of scratching coming from the back door. It was a soft, almost imperceptible sound, but it made my heart skip. It was as though someone, was on the other side, trying to get in. I tried to dismiss it. Maybe it was the wind. Maybe an animal had gotten trapped outside. But curiosity gnawed at me, and soon I found myself standing in front of the back door, staring at the old brass handle. It didn't seem threatening, but that feeling of unease wouldn't leave. I took a deep breath and turned the handle. It was heavier than I expected, like it was resisting. The door creaked open slowly, revealing the small, dimly lit hallway that led into the backyard. But something was wrong. The air was thick, the kind of stillness that made everything feel wrong, unnatural. There was no sound at all, not the usual hum of insects or the breeze rustling the trees outside. Just silence. I stepped through the door, my footfall muffled on the cold stone floor. As soon as I crossed the threshold, I noticed something strange. The hallway, which should have led directly outside, didn't. Instead, it seemed to stretch further than it should. The walls, once familiar, were now lined with shadowed corners and strange markings. I could hear my breath growing shallow, my pulse quickening as I realized the hallway was no longer the same. I tried to backtrack, but the door behind me had vanished. Where there had been a wooden frame, now there was only a wall. I pressed my hand against it, panic rising. It was solid, unyielding. The air smelled stale, heavy, like it hadn't been disturbed in years. A low, echoing hum began to vibrate through the air. It wasn't loud, but it was persistent, coming from deep within the walls, as if something was alive in there, watching me. My instinct screamed to run, but I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, unable to tear my gaze away from the shifting shadows at the end of the hallway. I took one slow step forward, then another, and as I did, the hallway began to stretch even further, like it was expanding. The walls warped, twisting, as though the very space around me was changing. I heard the faint sound of something scraping against the walls. No, not scraping. It was the sound of something crawling. I tried to turn back again, but every step I took led me deeper. The door, the way I had come in, was now completely gone. There was no exit, no escape. The more I moved, the further I seemed to get from any sense of reality. The floor beneath my feet turned slick, like it was made of something soft and rubbery. I stumbled, my hands reaching out for balance, only to feel them sink slightly into the surface. And then, in the farthest corner, I saw it. A shadow, slowly rising from the ground. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but as it grew taller, I realized it wasn't. It was a figure, dark, formless, but with something unmistakably human about it. It moved toward me, gliding across the floor without a sound. And as it drew closer, I felt my throat tighten, the weight of its presence pressing down on me. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't. The air was thick, heavy with something that didn't belong. The walls seemed to be closing in around me, narrowing, like the space itself was trying to trap me inside. The shadow reached out with a hand, its fingers long and cold, and as it touched my skin, a sharp pain shot through me. The world blurred around me, and I found myself back in the kitchen, gasping for air, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I looked around, confused. Everything seemed normal again, the door, the walls, the quiet hum of the house. But I knew what I'd seen. That hallway, that thing in the corner. It wasn't a dream. The back door was still there, and I knew it hadn't finished with me. The strange neighbors. I never thought much of the Johnsons. They were a quiet family, father, mother, and their 2 kids, who moved in across the street about a year ago. At first glance, they seemed like any ordinary suburban family. The father, Mr. Johnson, worked from home, and his wife, Mrs. Johnson, spent most of her time gardening or keeping the house tidy. Their children, a boy and a girl, were relatively quiet, though I never saw them play outside with the other neighborhood kids. It was their behavior that began to stand out. Little things at first, like the way they would always lock their windows at strange hours, or how they never seemed to have visitors. Occasionally, I would see them walking to the mailbox, but they never exchanged more than a few words. It struck me as odd, but I didn't think much of it. Everyone has their quirks, right? One evening, I was sitting on my porch, sipping coffee, when I noticed the Johnsons standing in their yard, facing each other. It wasn't unusual for people to stand in their yards, but they weren't talking. They were just staring at one another, their eyes fixed. It felt uncomfortable, almost like they were frozen in time. The boy was standing slightly behind his father, his posture stiff, and the girl stood next to her mother, her gaze fixed on the ground. The wind was still, and the whole scene felt eerie, too still. A few days later, I saw them again. This time, they were all outside, but there was something different. Mr. Johnson was holding a small, dark object in his hand, something that looked like a small stone or a figurine. He passed it to his wife, who, in turn, handed it to the children. They all seemed to be performing some sort of ritual, but what caught my attention was how carefully they handled the object, like it was fragile, like it held some kind of power. My curiosity got the better of me, and one night, I decided to take a walk past their house. The streetlights cast long shadows across the sidewalk, and I kept my distance, trying to stay hidden in the darkness. The Johnsons were in their living room, their lights dimmed low. Through the curtains, I could make out silhouettes, 4 figures, moving in unison. They were sitting in a circle, their heads bent, their hands placed on their laps. I froze, watching as they began to chant. It was faint, but I could hear the rhythm in their voices. The words didn't make sense, a language I had never heard before, but the tone was unsettling. It was as though they were calling something that wasn't meant to be summoned. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I wanted to turn around and walk away, but my legs felt like lead. I continued to watch them for a while until I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Their faces. Their eyes were wide, not with excitement, but with something else, something darker. Their pupils seemed unnaturally large, and their skin looked pale, almost sickly under the dim light. I couldn't tear my gaze away. It was like they were waiting for something. Suddenly, one of the children turned toward the window. Their eyes locked with mine for a split second before they quickly darted away, and I realized, with a jolt of fear, that they had seen me. I stumbled backward, turning and running home as quickly as I could. I didn't stop until I was safely inside my own house, my heart pounding in my chest. The next day, I avoided looking in their direction. But the feeling lingered. I could feel their presence, their eyes on me, even though I hadn't seen them. It was like they were waiting, watching, always just out of sight. The days passed, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. That evening, I saw them again. This time, they were standing at the edge of their property, staring at my house. The father was holding that same dark object, and they were all silent. I watched them for a moment, too terrified to move. I didn't know what they wanted, but I was certain they weren't ordinary people. The next morning, I decided to confront them. I had to know what was going on. I walked across the street to their front door, my heart pounding in my chest. I knocked 3 times. After a moment, the door creaked open, but no one was there. It was strange, but I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The house was different. It wasn't the neat, orderly place I remembered. The walls were covered in strange symbols, and the air was thick with an unsettling smell, something earthy and damp. The living room was empty, but I could hear faint whispering coming from upstairs. I took a deep breath and began to climb the stairs. The hallway was long and dark, and as I moved closer to the source of the sound, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. At the end of the hall, I saw the door to their master bedroom. The whispering was louder now, almost like a chant. I hesitated for a moment, but then pushed the door open. The room was empty, save for a large mirror hanging on the wall. But the reflection in the mirror wasn't mine. It was the Johnsons, standing in that same ritualistic circle, their faces twisted in unnatural expressions. Their eyes were wide and unblinking, their mouths moving, chanting those same strange words. They were no longer human. I turned and ran as fast as I could. I didn't look back, and I didn't stop until I was back in my house, locking the door behind me. Since then, I haven't seen them again. The house across the street is empty now, but every night, when I lie in bed, I feel their eyes on me. And sometimes, in the dead of night, I hear those whispers again. The Silent Dwarfs of the Circus. It was the summer of '98 when I first encountered the circus that would haunt me for the rest of my life. We were just passing through the small town on our way to the coast, and I spotted the colorful tents from the road, their bright flags fluttering in the breeze. My younger sister, Claire, tugged at my sleeve, urging me to stop. "Let's go. Let's see the circus," she begged. I wasn't particularly fond of the circus, but something about that particular night felt strange. There was an eerie stillness about the place. The town, usually bustling with life, seemed oddly quiet, like everyone had already disappeared into their homes. Nonetheless, I gave in to Claire's enthusiasm, and we headed toward the entrance. The ticket booth was manned by a grinning woman who handed us tickets without a word. Her smile seemed almost too wide, too unnatural, but I brushed it off. Inside, the atmosphere was unlike any circus I had ever seen. The air was thick, heavy with a smell I couldn't place, like wood leather and burning incense. The tent was dark, save for a few dim lights that cast long shadows across the ground, and a strange hum of music played in the background, though I couldn't identify the instruments. We found seats near the front, close to the center ring. The audience was sparse, just a few scattered families, their faces obscured in the shadows. A chill ran down my spine as the lights flickered and the show began. The first act was a troupe of acrobats. They were graceful, performing breathtaking flips and twists high above the ring. But something felt off. Their movements were too fluid, their smiles too rigid. They didn't seem to be enjoying themselves. As they performed, I caught sight of something in the far corner of the ring. A figure. There, hidden in the shadows, were 3 dwarfs. They were standing still, perfectly motionless. Their faces were covered in thick makeup, painted with exaggerated smiles, but their eyes were empty. Cold. They stared into the audience without blinking, never moving a muscle. Their clothes were old-fashioned, covered in tattered ruffles and lace, almost as if they had stepped out of another time. But it wasn't just their appearance that was unsettling. It was the silence around them. They didn't speak, not a single word. They just stood there. As the show continued, I couldn't shake the feeling that they were watching me. Their gaze never wavered. Claire, excited and oblivious, clapped enthusiastically for the acrobats, but I couldn't focus on the performance anymore. My attention was drawn to those dwarfs standing in the corner, like statues. Suddenly, the ringmaster appeared, his tall hat casting a shadow over his face. He was smiling, but his eyes were empty too. "Now," he announced, his voice low and gravelly, "prepare yourselves for the most mysterious act of the evening." The music shifted, becoming darker, more ominous. The dwarfs were called into the center of the ring. They moved slowly, deliberately, their movements synchronized in a way that didn't seem human. As they approached the center, the audience grew silent, almost expectant. They took their places without a word, standing in a line. Then, something happened. The air grew colder. A thick fog began to creep across the ground, swirling around the dwarf's legs. The lights flickered again, and I could hear the distinct sound of something, like a whisper. But not a whisper I could understand. It was a language, low and guttural, like an ancient chant. The dwarfs raised their arms in unison, and suddenly they spoke. But it wasn't words. It was a sound, a series of high-pitched, unintelligible noises that echoed through the tent. The audience didn't react. They just watched, entranced, as the dwarfs continued their chant, their bodies moving in time with the eerie music. And then, the figures in the audience began to move. I noticed a man, sitting a few rows ahead of us, stand up. His eyes were vacant, glazed over, as though he was sleepwalking. He turned toward the ring, his movements stiff, robotic. Another person stood up. Then another. All of them were moving in unison, following the dwarf's strange rhythm. I grabbed Claire's hand, my heart racing. Something wasn't right. These people weren't just watching the show, they were part of it. The dwarfs raised their hands higher, and a loud, echoing sound rang out. It was like a bell, deep and resonant, but there was no bell in sight. I looked around in panic, but the audience had completely transformed. They were no longer seated. They were standing, moving toward the center ring, their faces blank, their eyes locked onto the dwarfs. The ringmaster stepped forward, his grin widening as the crowd began to gather around the dwarfs. He raised his hands as well, and in that instant, the tent seemed to close in on me. The walls seemed to bend, the space warping, until the entire world felt like it was shrinking. I pulled Claire to her feet and started running toward the exit. The air was thick, like I was moving through molasses. Every step felt heavier, like something was holding me back. I turned to look over my shoulder, and that's when I saw it. The dwarfs were no longer standing still. They were moving, too, no, not moving. Gliding. Their tiny feet didn't touch the ground. They hovered above it, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light, and they were coming straight for me. I reached the exit and threw the door open, nearly collapsing as I stepped outside. The cool night air hit me like a wave, and I gasped for breath. Behind me, the circus remained eerily silent, as if it had never existed. I turned back to see the entrance, but it was gone. The tent, the lights, the audience, all of it had vanished. It wasn't until later that night, as I lay in bed, that I realized I had made a grave mistake. The dwarfs were not part of a circus. They were something else entirely, something ancient, something that should have stayed hidden. And now, I knew the truth. They never left. They were always there, waiting for the next person to fall under their spell. Waiting for the next soul to join their silent chant. Vampires in the TV tower. I had never liked working the night shift at the TV tower, but the pay was good, and I needed it. The tower, standing tall against the dark sky, was an icon of the city. But it was also a lonely place, isolated, the perfect environment for strange things to happen. That night, the wind howled outside, pressing against the thick glass of the observation floor where I worked. I glanced at the clock, just past midnight. The usual silence was unsettling. My shift was nearing its end, and I had grown accustomed to the endless quiet, interrupted only by the hum of the equipment. The tower, usually full of technicians, had been nearly empty this evening, with most of them gone home for the day. I made my rounds, checking the control panels, adjusting a few settings. But something about the night felt different. A chill crept through the room, despite the heat being on full blast. I shivered, brushing it off as the draft from the open windows downstairs. I moved toward the elevator shaft to check on the floors below, feeling a strange unease growing in my chest. As I passed the stairwell, I noticed something strange. There, at the far end of the corridor, was a figure. A tall, thin silhouette standing motionless. I froze, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. It wasn't one of the regular night staff. I would have recognized them. This figure was too still, too unnatural. I took a cautious step forward, but before I could get closer, the figure moved so fast it barely registered. It was like a shadow, flickering from one end of the hall to the other. I stumbled back, heart racing, as my mind struggled to make sense of what I had just seen. Was it a trick of the light? Or had I imagined it? I reached for my radio, but the signal was dead. I pressed the button again and again, but all I heard was static. My pulse quickened as I realized I was completely alone, cut off from the outside world. I had to get out of there. I hurried toward the elevator, but before I could press the button, the door at the end of the hallway opened with a creak. Several people stepped out, their movements fluid and silent. I blinked, unsure if I was seeing things. These people, they were different. Their eyes gleamed a strange, unnatural shade of red, and their skin was pale, almost translucent. They didn't speak. They didn't move like regular people. Their movements were deliberate, almost predatory. A sinking feeling washed over me as I realized the truth. Vampires. I had heard rumors about strange happenings in the city, whispers about people vanishing, but I never believed them. Now, standing in the hallway of the TV tower, I could no longer deny it. These weren't just rumors. These creatures were real. One of them, a tall man with sharp features and blood-red lips, took a step toward me. His eyes locked onto mine, and a cold chill ran through me. He smiled, but it wasn't a smile of kindness. It was the smile of a predator, one who knew exactly how much fear he had instilled in his prey. I backed away slowly, my feet scraping against the floor as I tried to keep my distance. But the vampires didn't rush. They moved slowly, circling me like wolves. They didn't need to hurry. They knew I couldn't escape. The elevator was behind me, but I didn't dare make a run for it. I could already hear the soft sound of their footsteps closing in. One of them, a woman with long, dark hair and sharp fangs, reached out with a gloved hand and grabbed my wrist. Her touch was icy, sending a shock of panic through my veins. "We don't like to be disturbed," she whispered, her voice low and smooth, almost hypnotic. "But since you're here..." The tall man with the red eyes stepped forward, his gaze never leaving mine. "It's too late to leave now. You'll join us soon enough." I struggled, trying to pull away, but their grip was ironclad. I could feel my pulse pounding in my throat, each beat a reminder that I was trapped. The vampire's cold, hungry eyes were fixed on me, and I knew that if I didn't act fast, I wouldn't leave the tower alive. With everything I had left, I kicked out, knocking over a nearby chair. It clattered loudly across the floor, distracting the vampires for a brief moment. That was all I needed. I broke free from their grasp and sprinted down the hall toward the emergency stairwell. I didn't stop to look behind me. I heard them move quickly, chasing me, but I pushed forward. I ran down the stairs as fast as I could, my legs burning with the effort. When I reached the ground floor, I could hear them closing in, the sound of their footsteps echoing in the narrow stairwell. I burst through the exit doors into the cold night air, gasping for breath. The city lights shone in the distance, but they felt so far away. I could hear the vampires' hissing voices from inside the tower. I didn't stop running until I reached the street and hailed a cab. The driver didn't ask questions, and I didn't tell him anything. I just wanted to get as far away from that tower as I could. As I sat in the back of the cab, my body shaking with adrenaline and fear, I realized something terrifying. The vampires weren't just confined to the tower. They were spreading, moving through the city, hiding in plain sight. And I had no doubt that they would return. The TV tower was no longer just a symbol of the city. It was their lair. And it would remain that way until they were ready to claim the city as their own. The elevator to the dungeon. I had just started my new job as a night shift security guard in an old, nearly forgotten office building. The kind of building that no one cared to look at anymore, faded brick, cracked windows, and the occasional flicker of fluorescent lights. The company I worked for had recently acquired the building, planning to renovate it, but for now, the office floors remained empty, dark, and eerie. The building was massive, towering over the streets like a relic from another time. It had once been a hub of activity, but now it was deserted, the only life being the occasional janitor or me on my rounds. My job was simple: walk the halls, make sure everything was secure, and keep an eye on the few remaining tenants. The elevator was an old, creaky thing that had seen better days. Every time I used it, the wires would groan and the doors would shudder as if resisting my presence. It was the kind of elevator you'd expect in a horror film, but one that doesn't just take you to your destination, but seems to have a mind of its own. One night, while finishing up my rounds, I had to take the elevator down to the basement to check on some maintenance issues. I pressed the button, and after a few seconds of waiting, the elevator doors slowly opened, revealing the dimly lit interior. The smell of dust and age lingered inside, making me hesitate for a moment. But I stepped in anyway. As the elevator began its descent, I noticed the floor numbers slowly counting down, 10, 9, 8. It felt like an eternity, the slow pace of the elevator unnerving. But as we passed the 4th floor, something strange happened. The elevator jerked, and then the numbers began to skip. It wasn't a mechanical failure, it was deliberate. The lights flickered, and the elevator stopped. The display blinked, B4. I felt a chill in the air, and a knot formed in my stomach. There was no B4 floor in the building. I knew every floor by heart, and the basement only had 2 levels, B1 and B2. But here I was, stuck between floors, with no idea where this 4th level had come from. The doors creaked, then opened. I hesitated. What I saw on the other side of the elevator doors was unlike anything I had expected. It wasn't the cold concrete walls of the basement that I had grown accustomed to. Instead, I was looking at an ancient stone hallway, lit by the flickering light of torches mounted on the walls. The air was heavy with the scent of mildew and something else, something metallic, like blood. I stepped out of the elevator, my heart pounding. The door shut behind me with a slow, deliberate sound, and the elevator began to rise again, leaving me in this strange, forgotten place. Panic gripped me, but I knew I had to keep moving. The hallway stretched ahead, its stone floor cold beneath my shoes. I could hear faint, distant sounds, scraping, soft footsteps echoing from deep within the bowels of the earth. The walls were adorned with faded tapestries and strange symbols I didn't recognize. They seemed to pulse with an energy I couldn't explain. The further I walked, the darker it became, as though the hallway itself was swallowing the light. Eventually, I came across a wooden door, half open, with a faint glow coming from the crack. I pushed it open cautiously, my heart racing in my chest. Inside was a room unlike anything I had ever seen. It was an underground chamber, filled with old, rusted chains and shackles hanging from the walls. The floor was stained with something dark, something that didn't look like any kind of soil or dirt I had ever seen before. The air was thick, suffocating, as though something had been trapped down here for years. At the far end of the room, I saw movement, a figure standing still in the shadows. Its back was to me, but I could make out the sharp outline of its hunched shoulders and long, clawed hands. For a moment, I froze. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The figure didn't turn, but I could feel its presence, as if it were aware of me, even without looking. Then, the door slammed shut behind me, the sound echoing in the chamber like a thunderclap. I spun around in panic, but there was no escape. The room had no other exits. The figure in the corner finally turned its head, slowly, deliberately, as though savoring the fear in my eyes. Its face was pale, gaunt, with hollow eyes and a mouth twisted in a grin that sent shivers down my spine. The air around it seemed to shimmer, warping with a cold energy. It took a step toward me, and my legs felt like lead. My body refused to move, trapped in place by the sheer terror of the creature before me. "You should not have come," it whispered, its voice like the scrape of nails on stone. "The elevator doesn't lead here for no reason." With every word, the room seemed to grow darker, the shadows pressing in from all sides. I felt the weight of something ancient, something dark, closing in on me, suffocating the very air I was trying to breathe. The figure took another step forward, its grin widening. Just as I thought I couldn't take it any longer, the elevator doors opened again, and I heard the sound of footsteps from behind me. My body reacted before my mind could catch up. I bolted for the elevator, barely managing to slip through the open doors before they slammed shut behind me. The elevator started to ascend immediately, and I collapsed against the back wall, panting, heart racing. The lights flickered, and the floor numbers started counting upward again. When I reached the ground floor, I stumbled out, drenched in sweat, my mind still reeling from what I had just witnessed. The building was silent once more, as though nothing had happened. But I knew better now. That elevator, that floor, whatever it wasn't just a mistake. It was a doorway to something far darker than I could ever imagine. And it had noticed me. Letters from the future. I never believed in fate, and I certainly didn't believe in anything as bizarre as messages from the future. But that all changed when the first letter arrived. It was an ordinary Tuesday, and I had just returned from my lunch break, ready to finish up the workday. As I entered my apartment, something caught my eye. There, on the kitchen table, was an envelope. It was plain, simple, with no address, no name. Just my name written in a neat, unfamiliar handwriting. I hesitated. The envelope looked as though it had been there for ages, but I knew I hadn't seen it before. Slowly, I picked it up, my heart pounding in my chest for reasons I couldn't explain. As I opened it, I found a single piece of paper inside. It was short, typed in a font I didn't recognize. "Do not go to the park today." I stood frozen, reading the words over and over. I didn't know what to think. My first instinct was to toss it aside, thinking it was a prank or some random letter. But something about it felt off, as if it was important. I decided to ignore it. After all, I had plans that evening to meet a friend at the park. Maybe it was just a coincidence, a strange message that had no meaning. But as the day went on, the thought lingered in the back of my mind, gnawing at me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I called my friend to cancel our plans, explaining that something had come up. But he was insistent, and eventually, I agreed to meet him. After all, the message had been vague. It didn't explain why or what was going to happen. By the time I arrived at the park, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the path. I spotted my friend, standing near the fountain. He waved, but his usual smile was absent, replaced by a look of concern. "Did you get the letter?" he asked before I could even speak. I froze. How did he know about the letter? "What are you talking about?" I stammered, trying to hide my unease. "The letter. The one that told you not to come here," he said, his voice low, almost fearful. I felt a chill run down my spine. How could he know that? I hadn't told anyone about it. Before I could answer, there was a loud crashing noise from the nearby woods. We both turned toward the sound, and for a moment, everything seemed to go still. Then, without warning, we heard the unmistakable sound of a car speeding down the path, its engine revving louder and louder as it drew closer. My friend grabbed my arm. "Run!" he shouted. I didn't hesitate. We turned and sprinted down the path, the sound of the car growing louder behind us. But no matter how fast we ran, the car was always just a few steps away, its headlights blinding us in the darkness. We finally reached the edge of the park, where the path split. My friend pushed me toward the street. "Go!" "I'll hold them off," he yelled. I didn't want to leave him, but I knew there was no choice. I turned and ran, heart hammering in my chest. The last thing I heard was the screeching of tires as the car veered off the path and into the woods. I didn't look back. When I got home, I collapsed onto the couch, gasping for air. My phone buzzed, and I looked at the screen. It was a new message from an unknown number. "You were supposed to die tonight." I stared at the message for a long time, my hands trembling. What had just happened? How could my friend have known about the letter, the car? It was as if everything had been set into motion by something beyond my control. The next morning, I went back to the park. The police had already arrived, and yellow tape surrounded the area where the crash had occurred. A few officers were talking near a wrecked car, but there was no sign of my friend. I approached one of the officers, my voice shaking. "What happened here? Was anyone hurt?" The officer looked at me with a blank expression. "There was no crash," he said. "No one was here." But I began, but he interrupted me. "You're mistaken. We've been here all morning. There's no crash site. No car. Nothing." I stood there, stunned. I knew what I had seen. I knew what had happened. But the evidence was gone. That night, as I lay in bed, another letter arrived. This time, it was different. The handwriting was unmistakable, my own. "You will meet him again soon. This time, there will be no escape." I stared at the letter in horror. And now was when I realized the truth. The letters weren't from the future. They were from me. From a future version of myself. But the question was, what had I done to change the course of my life? I didn't know how much time I had, but I was certain of one thing. Whatever was coming, it was inevitable. The gift without a sender. I never thought much of surprises. To me, life was all about routine. I worked as a junior architect in a modest office, spent evenings at home with a book, and weekends catching up on sleep. Nothing out of the ordinary. Or at least, nothing ever seemed to be until that day. It was a Wednesday when it happened. A regular, dreary workday, and I was sitting at my desk, sketching plans for a new office building. The hum of the city outside barely reached my ears as I focused on the blueprints. My coffee was cold, and the clock on the wall ticked slowly, like it always did. Then, the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone. I checked the clock again, 3 in the afternoon. No deliveries, no visitors. With a slight frown, I stood up and made my way to the front door. What I saw when I opened it made my pulse quicken. A small, unmarked box sat on the doorstep. It was wrapped in plain brown paper, with no writing, no return address. Just a simple string tied neatly around it. The box was light, almost hollow, and I couldn't help but feel an odd chill run down my spine. There was something unsettling about it, like it didn't belong in the world of ordinary things. I glanced around, but there was no one in sight. No delivery person, no car parked nearby. Nothing. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if this was some kind of prank. But who would send me a gift like this with no note, no explanation? Curiosity got the better of me, and I stepped inside, closing the door behind me. I placed the box on the kitchen table and began to untie the string. It came undone easily, and I peeled back the paper. Inside, there was a small wooden figurine. It was of a woman, no more than 6 inches tall, with delicate features, her hands clasped together in a prayer-like pose. The wood was dark and smooth, almost polished, and there was something strangely lifelike about her expression. She seemed too real. It felt like her eyes were watching me. I felt a slight tug of unease, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had to keep looking. I turned the figurine over, expecting to see a signature or some mark of its maker, but there was nothing. Just the smooth, untouched wood. The air in the room suddenly felt heavier, the silence more pronounced. A low hum seemed to vibrate from the figurine, barely noticeable at first but growing steadily. I backed away, instinctively reaching for my phone to check the time. It was almost 6 now. How had the time passed so quickly? And then the phone vibrated in my hand. A message. I opened it, half expecting something from a friend, maybe an email or a reminder for an appointment. But no, it was just a number I didn't recognize. You know what you have to do. My heart skipped a beat, and my hands started to shake. Who was this? What was happening? The message felt cryptic, like some sort of warning. My gaze flickered to the wooden figurine on the table. The hum had stopped, but the air still felt wrong, like I wasn't alone in the room anymore. I pushed the phone aside, trying to steady my thoughts. Maybe it was a scam or some sort of viral marketing. But that didn't explain the figurine. That didn't explain how it had appeared on my doorstep with no sender, no message. And it didn't explain the sickening feeling that had lodged itself in my stomach. I picked the figurine up again, this time more cautiously. I turned it over in my hands, searching for any clue, any indication of its origin. That's when I noticed something small and nearly hidden etched into the base of the figurine. A date. The year was recent, but the month and day, they were today's date. The message seemed to click into place in my mind, as though something deep within me knew exactly what to do. Suddenly, the lights flickered. My phone buzzed again, and this time, the same unknown number had sent another message. It will all end when you let it go. I dropped the figurine, the floor creaking beneath me as I stepped back. The room felt colder now, and the silence was deafening. The phone screen flashed, this time showing a picture of the figurine in my hands, but it wasn't me holding it. It was someone else, their fingers wrapped around it tightly. I was frozen, staring at the screen. The feeling of being watched intensified, and my heart raced in my chest. The figurine on the floor seemed to shift, its face now facing me directly. The eyes were no longer lifeless, there was something alive in them. something, waiting. The doorbell rang again. I didn't move. I couldn't. My mind was racing, trying to comprehend everything that was happening. The phone vibrated once more. Leave the figurine where it lies. But it was too late. I turned slowly to the door. And there, standing on the other side of the glass, was someone, or something, wearing a face I couldn't recognize. It was smiling. The final call. I never expected something as ordinary as a Zoom meeting to turn into something so horrific. But that's exactly what happened. It was a regular Tuesday morning. I logged into a team meeting like I always did, barely awake, sipping coffee, and ready to tackle the usual workday tasks. I was just a junior analyst at a small marketing firm, and while I didn't mind my job, it wasn't anything exciting. Most of my meetings felt like a waste of time, and this one wasn't going to be any different. I joined the call and saw the familiar faces of my colleagues pop up on the screen. Tina, the team leader, Mark from sales, Janet from HR, and Alex from finance. We exchanged half-hearted greetings, each of us preparing to get through the next hour of updates and numbers. "All right, everyone, let's get started," Tina said, her face looking tired but determined. "We've got a lot to cover today, so let's go ahead and dive in." The meeting proceeded as usual: updates, reports, tasks, deadlines. But something felt off. The energy was strange, a little too tense. The voices of my colleagues seemed muffled, their expressions more distant than usual. I could hear faint background noises that didn't seem right, like low whispers or shifting sounds, but I dismissed them as distractions from the early morning. Then it happened. Mark, who had been discussing a project update, suddenly stopped mid-sentence. His face froze, and his eyes widened. He looked like he had seen something terrifying. We all waited for him to continue, but instead, he clutched his throat, his mouth gasping for air. "Mark?" Tina called out, her voice tinged with concern. "Are you okay?" But Mark didn't answer. His breathing became labored, and his face turned pale. For a moment, it looked like he might pass out, but then he collapsed forward, his head hitting the desk with a sickening thud. The screen went black for a second, and I felt my stomach churn. "Tina?" I said, my voice shaky. "What the hell is going on?" But Tina wasn't responding. Her face remained frozen on the screen, her eyes wide open in shock. She reached for her throat, just like Mark had, her lips struggling to form words. Then, without warning, she slumped back in her chair, her head lolling to one side. I heard a faint, unsettling sound, like a soft gasp, before she, too, disappeared from the screen. My heart raced in my chest. What was happening? What was going on? I looked at the remaining faces, Janet and Alex, and saw the same thing unfolding in front of me. Janet clutched her chest as if she couldn't breathe, her face contorting with pain. She fell backward, her image freezing mid-fall, her screen turning black as she disappeared from the call. Then Alex's image flickered, and his mouth opened in a silent scream. He, too, succumbed to whatever had taken them, his body jerking violently before his camera turned off. I was the last one left. Alone. I stared at my own reflection in the screen, my mind racing. My pulse was pounding in my ears, my hands trembling uncontrollably. What the hell had just happened? I couldn't breathe properly either. My chest tightened, my throat constricted. A part of me wanted to leave the call, to disconnect, but my fingers wouldn't obey. I just watched, frozen. And then I saw it. A message appeared in the Zoom chat window. Don't breathe. My heart skipped a beat, and I felt a cold sweat trickle down my back. My breath caught in my throat, and a strange sensation washed over me, a suffocating pressure, as if the room itself was closing in on me. The walls of my apartment felt like they were getting smaller, the air thick and stifling. I heard a voice, soft, whispering, like a breath at the back of my neck, but when I turned around, there was nothing. It's not over. The screen blinked, and suddenly the room grew colder. My breath became shallow, and I could see my own exhale in the air. Panic surged through me as I reached for the mouse to end the call. But I couldn't move. My body was paralyzed, trapped within the confines of the meeting that had now become a nightmare. Another message appeared in the chat. One more remains. My screen flickered again, and I saw the face of my former colleague, Thomas, who had left the company months ago. He hadn't been part of the meeting, yet there he was, his eyes wide with terror, standing in the corner of his own image. His face was pale, his lips cracked. He looked like he had seen something unimaginable. And then the voice whispered again, clearer now. We are all still here. A sharp, unbearable pain shot through my chest. My vision blurred, and the screen before me swam in and out of focus. I struggled to breathe, but each breath felt more suffocating. The dark whispering filled the room, echoing in my ears. It was as if the room was alive, watching me, closing in. You're not leaving. I tried to scream, but nothing came out. The screen faded to black, and I felt the darkness swallow me whole. I don't know how long I was trapped in that place, in that meeting. When I finally woke up, my phone was dead, and the computer was shut off. There were no signs of the call, no traces of the others who had been on the line. My apartment was still, unnervingly quiet. But I can still hear the whispers. I still see their faces, frozen in time. They're with me now, always. The silent wait. I had always heard about sleep paralysis, but never believed it could happen to me. It was just one of those things that happen to other people, right? They always described it as a nightmare, something you read about in articles or hear from friends. But when it happened to me, it felt like a reality so terrifying, so crushing, that I couldn't have imagined it in my worst dreams. It started one evening after a long day at work. I was exhausted, physically and mentally drained, so I decided to go to bed early. The room was dark, the only light coming from the street lamp outside filtering through the blinds. I slipped under the covers and closed my eyes, welcoming the feeling of rest, but I never expected what was to come. At first, it was peaceful. My mind drifted, my body relaxing into the soft mattress, but then everything stopped. It was like I was awake, but not awake. My eyes fluttered open, yet I couldn't move. Panic began to set in as I tried to shift, tried to lift my hand, but nothing happened. My body felt like it was made of stone, frozen in place, heavy, like something was pressing down on me. The room was silent, but I could feel a presence in the darkness. A suffocating pressure on my chest, like someone or something was sitting on me, pinning me to the bed. My heart began to race, but I still couldn't move. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. It was as if my voice was trapped in my throat, choked by the invisible weight pressing down on me. I could hear a faint breathing, low and slow, coming from the corner of the room. My eyes darted, desperate to see who or what was there, but the shadows only seemed to grow darker. I could feel it, though. Something was watching me. Waiting. I couldn't see it, but I could sense it, lurking in the space just beyond my reach. It wasn't human. It was something darker. Then I felt it, cold fingers running lightly across my skin, a soft touch that made my skin crawl. It was gentle at first, like a whisper, but then it grew more insistent. The touch was harder, colder, and it seemed to travel over my body as if searching for something. I couldn't move. I couldn't fight back. I was completely helpless. Tears welled up in my eyes, but they didn't fall. I couldn't even blink. The pressure on my chest intensified, making it harder and harder to breathe. My heart pounded faster, and I thought I was going to suffocate under the invisible weight. The breathing in the corner grew louder, closer. I wanted to look, to see what was there, but my eyes wouldn't obey. I could only sense its movement, creeping closer with every breath I took. I could feel the air shift, feel it hover above me like a thick fog. Finally, I managed to shift a finger, just a tiny movement, but it felt like breaking free from chains. I pushed harder, fighting with everything I had left. Slowly, agonizingly, my limbs started to respond. My eyes locked onto the dark corner of the room, and I saw it, a shape, shifting in the shadows, standing just beyond the edge of my vision. A silhouette, tall and thin, its limbs too long, stretching unnaturally, bending at impossible angles. It was watching me. I screamed then. The sound came rushing out of me like a dam breaking, and the weight lifted. The pressure on my chest disappeared. The cold fingers stopped touching me. I could move again. My body shook violently as I gasped for air, my chest heaving as if I had just run miles. I turned on the lamp, flooding the room with light. The shadows shrank back, and the room seemed normal again, nothing out of place. But I knew what I had felt. I knew what I had seen. My heart was still racing, and my mind was reeling, trying to make sense of the experience. Was it real? Had I imagined it? The doubt lingered in my mind, but deep down, I knew it was no dream. The terror, the feeling of being trapped, of something being there with me, it was too vivid, too real. That night, I never slept. The weight of that invisible presence hung over me long after the episode had ended, and it stayed with me in the silence of the room even when the light was on. I could feel it watching me still. The cheerleaders' last game. The bus was full of excitement, the kind of energy you only feel when heading to a big game. A championship, no less. Our cheerleading team was on our way to support the football team who had a chance to make it to state. Everyone was hyped, laughing, joking, some of the girls putting on their makeup, others going over their routines. I was one of them, sitting by the window, glancing out at the passing scenery. It was a late autumn afternoon, the sun sinking low, casting long shadows on the road. I didn't think much of it when the driver took a sharp turn down a narrow, winding path. It was odd, sure, but our coach had planned the shortcut through the woods to avoid traffic, and we all trusted her judgment. I was more concerned with getting the perfect cheerleading pose for our halftime performance than the twists and turns of the road. The first sign something was wrong was when the tires hit something hard. There was a sudden jolt, a deafening screech of metal against pavement, and the bus lurched to the side. Screams filled the air as we were thrown into each other. I clutched the seat in front of me, but before I could react, there was another sharp turn and then silence. The bus came to a stop with an eerie stillness, the engine sputtering to a halt. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could taste the faint metallic tang of fear in the air. I looked around, dazed. The seats were in disarray, some girls on the floor, others holding their heads. Everyone was shaken up, but no one appeared seriously injured. It was the kind of accident you always see in movies, where everyone's rattled but no one's really hurt. But something wasn't right. The air felt thick. There was no sound from the outside world, no birds, no rustling leaves. Just the oppressive silence of the woods. Coach Bennett, the driver, was still behind the wheel, motionless. I couldn't see her face, but I could feel her stiffened posture. When she turned slowly, I noticed her pale skin and wide eyes. She didn't say a word as she opened the door and stepped out into the foggy woods. We waited a few minutes, but when she didn't return, a few of the braver girls decided to check it out. Megan, the team captain, stood up first, trying to get our attention. "Everyone stay here. We'll be fine," she said, but even her voice wavered. She glanced at the rest of us, then nodded toward the door. "I'm going to see what's going on." She opened the bus door and stepped out, followed by a few others, though I stayed behind. I had a feeling something was off, but I couldn't place it. My instinct screamed at me to stay inside, but I didn't want to look like a coward. The group ventured out into the trees, and that's when the air seemed to shift. There was a sudden, unnerving chill that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The light from the bus's headlights barely cut through the fog that had begun to roll in, casting everything in an unnatural glow. I could just make out the figures of my teammates, looking small and distant in the thickening fog. A few minutes later, I heard the first scream, a high-pitched, terrified sound that echoed through the trees. It was Megan. I felt my stomach drop, and my pulse quickened. The rest of the team screamed too, but they didn't come back. Instead, the forest seemed to swallow them up, their cries fading into the eerie silence. I wanted to run. My breath came in shallow gasps, and my hands trembled as I fumbled with the seatbelt. I could hear the faint sound of footsteps outside, slow, deliberate, like someone or something was moving toward us. Then, from the edge of the fog, I saw them. Tall, hunched figures, moving with unsettling grace through the trees. They were almost human in shape, but their limbs were too long, their bodies too thin. Their faces were distorted, their features jagged, like something out of a nightmare. Their eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the light from the bus, and their mouths stretched wide in grotesque, predatory grins. Panic surged through me as I realized the figures weren't human. They were something else, something worse. Something hungry. One of them let out a low, guttural growl, and the others followed suit, their bodies jerking toward the bus. My heart raced, and I slammed my hands against the bus window, shouting for my teammates to get back inside. But they didn't hear me. They were too far gone, too far into the woods, to come back. I knew in that moment that they weren't going to make it. The figures were closing in on them, their movements swift and brutal, and I could hear the sickening sounds of bone cracking and flesh tearing. My breath caught in my throat as I realized, whatever they were no ordinary predators. They were something ancient, something that thrived on terror, on flesh. I glanced back at the bus door, hesitating. I could run. I could leave everything behind. But something told me that staying hidden was the only chance I had left. I crouched down in my seat, praying they wouldn't notice me. The creatures were getting closer, their silhouettes blotting out the fog as they circled the bus. For what felt like an eternity, the only sounds were their heavy, labored breaths and the occasional rustle of leaves. Then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, the creatures vanished. The fog shifted, and the woods seemed to return to its unnatural stillness. But I knew the danger wasn't over. I waited in that bus for what felt like hours, too terrified to move, too afraid to leave. When morning finally came, the fog had lifted, and the woods were quiet once more, but there were no signs of my teammates. No traces of the creatures, no evidence that anything had ever happened. The only thing that remained was the silence and the memory of their screams. Greg's last walk. It started like any other Tuesday. I had just finished my shift at the diner, the sun was beginning to set, and I was heading home to my small, one-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of town. The streets were eerily quiet, save for the occasional car passing by. It was odd, considering it was rush hour, but I thought nothing of it. I put my headphones in, lost in thought as I walked down the sidewalk, the chill in the air making me tug my jacket tighter around my shoulders. Then I saw Greg. He was a regular at the diner. A quiet guy, always sitting in the same booth, always ordering the same thing, coffee, black, no sugar. He was a loner, but a decent one. No one expected him to be part of any trouble. He worked at the gas station down the road, and I would often see him on my way to work. But now, he was standing in the middle of the street, not moving. Just standing there, staring blankly ahead. I paused, confused. It wasn't like Greg to just freeze in place, especially not on a busy street. I pulled one earbud out, watching him, trying to make sense of it. He looked pale, his face sunken, like he'd lost weight. His eyes, they were wrong. The usual calmness I saw in them was gone, replaced by something distant, almost vacant. I called out to him, stepping closer. "Greg? Hey, you okay?" He didn't respond. Just stood there, completely still. My stomach churned. Something wasn't right. Then, without warning, Greg jerked. His head turned, snapping in my direction with unnatural speed, and I took an involuntary step back. The look in his eyes, it was cold, almost animalistic. His mouth was slack, lips curled into a slight snarl as he staggered toward me. I froze for a second, my mind racing. I knew Greg. He wasn't like this. But now, he was coming toward me like a predator stalking prey. "Greg?" I said, my voice trembling, but he didn't seem to recognize me. He moved closer, faster this time, as if the space between us was shrinking with every heartbeat. I started backing away, my legs moving faster than I could think. My mind was screaming at me to run, but my feet were hesitant, unsure. And then, it happened. Greg lunged at me. I stumbled backward, falling to the pavement with a loud thud. My heart was hammering in my chest, my breath coming in quick, panic bursts. I could hear his ragged breathing now, almost like a growl as he crawled on all fours toward me. His hands, pale and clammy, scraped against the ground as he got closer. I kicked out, connecting with his chest, sending him sprawling backward. He snarled, this guttural, unsettling sound that made my blood run cold. I scrambled to my feet, glancing around, desperate for help. But there was no one. The street was still empty. It felt like the whole world had stopped, and I was alone with this thing. I ran. I don't even remember exactly how I made it back to my apartment, but I did. My heart was racing, my mind a blur. I slammed the door shut behind me, locking it with trembling hands. I collapsed against it, gasping for air. The world outside was still silent, but in my mind it was filled with the sound of Greg's growls, his twisted movements, and that vacant look in his eyes. I tried calling the diner. No answer. I tried calling the gas station where Greg worked. Nothing. My hand shook as I looked out of my window, half expecting to see him standing out there, watching. Hours passed, but the terror wouldn't leave me. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. Every shadow outside my window felt like it was hiding something, and every creak of the floorboards made my heart skip a beat. The next morning, the news broke. There was a citywide alert about a strange outbreak. People were getting sick, feverish, pale, and violent. The reports mentioned attacks on the streets, people behaving wrong. But they didn't say anything about Greg. I knew, though. I knew that whatever was happening, it started with him. I didn't go outside that day. Or the next. The world outside my apartment had changed, and I wasn't sure how or why. But I could still hear his growls in my head, the sound of his nails scraping against the pavement, and I knew that I wasn't safe anymore. Not in this city. Not with what Greg had become. This has been a long, dark journey through the night with Whisper Crowley. Thank you for staying with us until the end. Leave a like if these stories made you look at the darkness a little differently, and share in the comments what you enjoyed most or what gave you chills. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss our next Sinister Whispers. Until we meet again in the world of shadows.